Hello everyone and welcome to what I intend to be the single most comprehensive and informative guide available for German ground forces and War Thunder. In this guide, I'm going to be going lineup by lineup all the way from reserve to top tier, explaining not just how to best utilize these vehicles as individual units, but how to employ them in concert with one another in order to play as effectively and efficiently as possible. To do this with each lineup, I'll start out by providing a brief description of each individual vehicle along with some background gameplay of them. If there are any premiums or event vehicles I subjectively feel are worth mentioning, usually due to them either being great event grinders or due to them being particularly fun, I'll also give those a mention. I'll then be covering any aircraft which I find to be effective when running ground battles, and also explain how to use their most effective ordnance options. Once all the vehicles are covered individually, I'll discuss my preferred playstyle for the lineup as a whole. During this section, I'll put on screen a color-coded specifications table for all of the vehicles in that lineup, giving you an easy to understand visual comparison of the vehicles without having to go looking through the game or the wiki. Germany starts out with a pretty fleshed out reserve/1.0 lineup, including 2 light tanks, 2 medium tanks, and even a derp gun. The first of these vehicles is actually not technically a German tank though, this is the Panzer XXXV-T. This Czechoslovakian light tank pressed into German service is a mostly middle-of-the-road vehicle with alright armor and mobility, though it's stuck with a short 37mm gun, which is admittedly not very strong for the battle rating, especially in terms of penetration. Features worth noting include a reversible gearbox and a shoulder stabilizer for its main gun, which will allow you to get your gun on target a little bit faster than some of your competitors. Also, do keep in mind its default APHE shell lacks a tracer weirdly enough, though you can unlock a different shell later with one which has slightly less penetration. This is ultimately a fine vehicle all around, but in most cases you're going to be relying on the next tank we'll talk about, the Panzer III E. This is a very mobile and relatively well-armored medium tank for the BR, which also has quite decent survivability thanks to its 5-man crew and large amount of internal volume. It does have slightly less main gun pen than the 35T, but it also has a faster reload, which somewhat makes up for this. It also gets smoke grenades, which is a nice quality of life feature for a vehicle of this battle rating. And then there's the Panzer III-B. This is an earlier Panzer III variant than the E, with only half the armor thickness, as well as a transmission which can only get it up to half the max speed of the E, despite it having a actually better horsepower to weight ratio. Not gonna lie guys, there's not really any reason to use this thing, as its only real advantage is a better turret traverse speed. Otherwise, this should really only be a backup vehicle and nothing else. Now getting on to the weird stuff, first we have the Sturmpanzer II, sometimes called the Bison. This is basically an open-top Panzer II chassis with a low-velocity 150mm howitzer stuck onto it. Despite the fact that it's terrible in just about every other way, its gun is so massively destructive that it can be easily brought into significantly higher battle ratings to earn the God Mode achievement with very little difficulty. The heat shell will be more practical at this BR since it will be able to easily pen or overpressure just about anything it encounters, and also has a higher velocity, but HE may be better if you're taking this vehicle into higher tiers where the heat penetration may no longer be as effective. And lastly, we have a vehicle which has, I believe, an entirely unique weapon system in the game right now, the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 221, aka the Squeeze Boy. And essentially this is a go-kart with a very large, very weird anti-tank rifle strapped onto it. Said anti-tank rifle is of a squeeze bore design, meaning the barrel actually squeezes the round down in size, in this case from a 28 to a 20mm projectile. It only fires APCR though, which causes so little post-penetration damage that you will often need to basically snipe individual crew members from within the vehicle you're engaging. You do have a few different options for aircraft in this lineup, starting out with the HE-51 family. There's not a whole lot to talk about here, as these are just biplanes, though pretty good ones at that. Their LMGs have a high rate of fire and good damage output, and they do get combat flaps, which can be helpful. The only major difference worth mentioning among the different variants is that the C version gets access to some tiny 10kg fragmentation bombs, which are really only effective against open tops, but can theoretically kill some lighter vehicles with a direct hit. While not very practical, trying to land one of these directly onto some unfortunate light tank's engine deck does make for a fun minigame. Another biplane you have access to, which carries significantly more firepower, is the HS-123. While not quite as nimble as its fighter counterpart, this biplane attack aircraft can carry a quite impressive load of 1 250kg and 4 50kg bombs, all mounted relatively close to center line and all dropping separately. This will give you a substantial amount of killing power against ground units on an airframe which is also maneuverable enough to combat enemy fighters. There is also another attack aircraft option though, which is the B2 variant of the Ju-87 StuG. This aircraft will allow you to replace the centerline 250 kilogram bomb on the HS-123 for a 500 or even a hilariously large 1000 kilogram bomb, and gives you access to a tail gunner, though the airframe is a lot less nimble. Looking at this lineup overall, the three vehicles I would typically use as my first spawns are the Panzer III-E, the Bison, and the go-kart. The Panzer III tends to be the best all-rounder in most situations, having the best overall combination of armor, mobility, and firepower in my opinion, with a 35T in second and the 3B in a distant third. For some close-range urban maps though, the Bison may be a better first spawn option due to how powerful its main gun is, and since close quarters will make it easier to use its low-velocity shells. What I would tend to do on these sorts of maps is stick behind the main part of your team, pop out occasionally to destroy heavily armored enemies your teammates are having trouble with, then pop back into cover while you wait for your long reload to finish. For particularly large open maps though, you may want to use the go-kart. You can use its speed to rush into advantageous positions early and then start peppering enemies with your fast-firing, high-pen main gun in order to split their attention between you and your teammates. You unfortunately don't really have an SPAA for this lineup, but people often forget the best SPAA can sometimes be fighters. Looking at your aircraft, the HE-51 is going to be your best bet for clearing out the airspace if there's a lot of enemy CAS around. If there aren't many enemy aircraft up, but you have plenty of ground targets to deal with, I would recommend the StuG, and if you need to deal with both, the HS-123 makes for the best multi-role fighter bomber. Your 1.3 lineup is even more stacked than the last, with 2 medium tanks, 2 light tanks, an SPAA, and 2 tank destroyers. The first vehicle we'll look at is yet another Czech one, the Panzer 38TA. This is a similar vehicle to the Panzer 35 in your 1.0 lineup, but with a slightly stronger main gun, a bit higher top speed and power to weight ratio, though it does lose out on the reversible gearbox, resulting in a drastically worse reverse speed. This is overall just a very alright tank. The main gun is decent, especially in terms of post-pen damage, but may struggle against some of the more well-armored vehicles you can encounter in an up tier. Like its predecessor though, this vehicle is going to get overshadowed by its domestic German counterpart, the Panzer II F. This Panzer III swaps out the short 37mm gun for a short 50mm, which is going to massively increase its offensive power. This vehicle is superior to the 38T in just about every way, other than reload rate and turret traverse. Otherwise, it's highly mobile, reasonably well protected, and the increase in punch from the better gun is definitely noticeable. Then you have the Panzer IV-C. This vehicle in real life was, I believe, actually designed for infantry fire support, so instead of a proper anti-tank gun, you get a short-barreled 75mm, designed primarily to fire low-velocity, high-explosive rounds. It does get access to a heat shell with 80mm of pen though, and is decently mobile with a high rate of fire, and while its armor isn't great, it's still relatively survivable just due to its large size and 5-man crew. Next we have the Panzer II-C. This light tank has similar armor and mobility to the other Panzers in this lineup, but instead of a proper main gun, it has a 20mm autocannon. This autocannon uses 10-round clips with a long reload in between, and should primarily be used with HVAP. And now we reach what is probably the highlight of this lineup, the Flakpanzer I. While having worse mobility and survivability than the proper tanks in this lineup, the Flakpanzer gets access to an even better 20mm autocannon than the Panzer II-C, which has double the magazine capacity, a higher rate of fire, plus twice as fast a reload speed between mags. This makes the Flakpanzer unbelievably destructive, and the experience of fighting other tanks at this BR with this thing feels like playing a first-person shooter game where you have a submachine gun, but where everyone else has a bolt-action rifle. Also, if you do want to use this thing against aircraft, I wouldn't bother using the HE belts since their HE filler is so low. I've had much more luck just running HVAP since it will one-hit engines and pilots. Next is another retrofitted Panzer I chassis, the Panzerjager I. This is basically an open-top tank destroyer with a fast-firing Czech 47mm gun fitted to the top. To be honest, I don't find the gun to be noticeably better than the 50mm on the Panzer III, especially since the shells only have half as much HE filler, though it does have a faster reload speed. And lastly, we have another tank destroyer, the Sd.Kfz 251/9. Basically, this is just a half-track mounting the same short 75mm as the Panzer IV, but this vehicle gets a better heat shell with 115mm of pen. This overwhelmingly strong damage output combined with this chassis' great mobility actually makes this vehicle incredibly good for flanking, despite the limitations that arise from the fact that its armor will really only protect it against rifle caliber fire. For aircraft, you have a few different options. Starting off, you have 2 monoplane fighters with twin light machine guns, the Bf-109B1 and the HE-112V5. My advice for either of these aircraft is going to be the same: stay fast, boom and zoom, and don't get sucked into turn fights with biplanes. Do also try to aim for the front of enemy fighters where the cockpit and engines are located, because their damage output is not very impressive. For CAS, we have a couple different options. First is the Ju-87R2, which is similar to the B2 Stuka, but loses the wing-mounted 50-kilogram bombs in return for an improved airframe. To be honest, not really a worthwhile trade-off in my opinion. You also have the G1 Stuka, which instead of bombs carries a pair of 37mm cannons. These cannons only have HVAP rounds for anti-tank use though, meaning low post-pen damage, and only gets 12 shots each, so it's a bit limited with what it can do. These cannons are also mounted very low and off to the side, so it's going to take a little bit of getting used to aim them properly. Overall, 1.3 is one of those lineups where you have a lot of different options, and nearly all of them are good. The Panzer III is the sort of on-paper best vehicle in the lineup, but all the others are totally capable of doing well also. Obviously, on smaller maps with more confined engagement areas, the Panzer IV-C and the 251 with their low-velocity heat slingers are going to be the most effective, but otherwise I would advise you to give all these vehicles a try and just see what you prefer. And if things go poorly, you can always just bring out the Flakpanzer as a second spawn and annihilate absolutely everyone you encounter. On the aircraft side, things are less impressive though, and honestly, I think the HE-51 and the HS-123 are better suited for ground RB than what you have available at this BR. Though I know there are people out there with much better aim than me who can do some serious damage with the cannon Stukas. 1.7 is a bit of a smaller lineup. We only have two vehicles here, and those are the Panzer II F and the Flakpanzer 38, and the TLDR is neither of these are very noteworthy. The Panzer II F is extremely similar to the C, 1BR rung below it, just with a different armor layout and a faster firing main gun, which isn't really all that useful due to the fact that it has very small magazines and a long magazine change time. Still, this vehicle can be situationally very strong, as long as you use its autocannon more like a semi-automatic weapon than a machine gun, and this is especially true if you can pull off a successful flank in a down tier like this enemy team learned the hard way. The Flakpanzer 38 meanwhile has an identical 20mm cannon to the Flakpanzer 1, but with a more mobile and better armored chassis. That being said, you still only have two crew, so you're going to get insta-killed left and right, and the larger size of the chassis will make you a lot more conspicuous, so really this vehicle could be charitably described as a side grade at a higher BR. Looking at aircraft, you do get a couple of other monoplane fighters armed with machine guns, as well as another cannon Stuka, but I think the vehicle most worthy of mention here by far is the HE-112A0. This aircraft has a high-velocity 20mm autocannon firing through the propeller hub, which fires API rounds with 37mm of pen, and has a full 100 rounds of ammunition. This basically turns you into a low-tier A-10, being able to destroy or damage huge numbers of enemies if you're left unchecked. It also is not a slouch in dogfights and can pull double duty killing aircraft as well. While the A0 is a very fun aircraft, honestly I don't think you're missing much if you just skip this lineup. Both vehicles at this battle rating are foldered anyways, so you don't even need to unlock them to progress. If you are hellbent on spading everything though, the Panzer II is definitely the better of the two vehicles here, and I would use it to try and aggressively flank, kill as many enemies as possible, and then spawn in the HE-112 to help mop up any stragglers. Getting into 2.0, this lineup may look a bit less flushed out than some of the other battle ratings, but this lineup is more interesting than it might appear at first, especially because of a few interesting event vehicles, which you'll definitely want to take a look at. Before we get into those though, let's first take a look at the two tanks which will be your primary first spawns for this lineup, the Panzer IV-E and the Panzer IV F1. These tanks are mostly identical to the previous Panzer IV-C, but get access to an improved heat shell and improved armor. It's this armor that serves as the primary difference between the E and the F1. The E still has 30mm front armor plates, but there's an additional 30mm spaced armor layer on the front of the hull, while the F1 swaps out both the hull and the turret armor for 50mm plates. This results in the E having technically thicker armor on the hull and marginally better mobility, but the F1 is going to be the better all-rounder in most cases, since the extra 20mm of armor on the turret is well worth losing 10 on the hull in my opinion. We also have yet another 20mm HVAP slinger, the Sd.Kfz 222. This is basically an open-top go-kart with a Panzer II's armament, and while its build is an SPAA, because the 20mm is limited to 10-round magazines and has long reload time like the Panzer II, it's not especially effective in this role. Lastly, we have three different armored cars whose long designations I will not waste your time by reading out. Basically, these are all relatively well-protected light vehicles with different armaments and great mobility. The reason all three of these vehicles are interesting to us is that these are event vehicles, and that means any match in which you use these vehicles will have its score counted towards whatever ground RB event you're trying to grind out, whereas usually only tier 3 vehicles and above would count. And to be clear, that's all the score you get throughout the entire match, not just what you earn with the vehicle itself. So if you ever see an opportunity to pick up one of these vehicles, whether it be through some sort of future event, the Warbond shop, or the marketplace, definitely take advantage. And you can definitely expect to pick up some extra score through the aircraft at this BR, since you have a number of interesting options to choose from. There's one fighter at this battle rating, the HE-112B0, which finally gives you access to some proper 20mm cannons. Like I mentioned with all the other early monoplane fighters, be cautious when it comes to biplanes since you will lose to them in a turn fight, and also make sure you stay conscious of the fact that your 20mm will have far less trigger time than your machine guns. To better deal with this, I would recommend setting up a keybind to either fire your cannons and machine guns separately, or to switch between armament selection so that you can use your MGs to spray and pray while conserving your cannon ammunition for only shots you're very confident in. Now on to the attackers. First is the famous Duck, the HS-129B3, which gets a massive 75mm anti-tank gun strapped to its belly, which can easily one-shot nearly any vehicle you might encounter. Make sure to use APHE rounds though, because those have better post-penetration damage and better penetration against angled armor than the HVAP rounds. The downside is though, you get a very limited ammo count and the engines are a bit underpowered considering the heavy weight of this aircraft with all the armor and firepower fitted to it, so be very mindful about conserving your energy. We also have the D3 Stuka, which can carry a more practical loadout of one centerline bomb and 450 kilograms on the wings, but can carry just a single comically large 1800 kilogram bomb on the centerline if you feel like it, which is basically a tactical nuke at this BR. My personal favorite though is the Ju-88A1. This aircraft can carry a very practical bomb load of two 500 kilogram and two 250 kilogram bombs, basically mounted centerline, and also gets a bomb sight, which, due to the agility of this airframe, can basically be used like a sort of pseudo-bomb CCIP. Just make sure autopilot for gunner and bomb sights is set to no, otherwise you'll have to fight the autopilot while doing this. This airframe can also take enormous amounts of punishment, which combined with its two defensive turrets can make this aircraft quite troublesome for low-tier fighters to deal with. Overall, I think 2.0 is quite a good lineup even in spite of being a bit smaller. The Panzer IV F1 especially is quite an effective first spawn vehicle, and on larger maps, the 222 can also fill this role if you can find a good flanking route which gets you onto the enemy's sides. The 20mm HVAP is definitely starting to lose some of its effectiveness at this BR, but as long as you can get enough spawn points to call in air support, you can still do a lot of work for your team. All of the event vehicles I've mentioned also make for great first spawns thanks to their decent protection and great mobility and firepower, but just be aware that with open tops, they're quite vulnerable to aircraft and artillery, so be extra cautious if you get attacked by either. Moving on to 2.3, we get more Czech stuff with two more variants of the Panzer 38. The first is the 38F, which is very similar to the 38A, but it gets its whole armor nearly doubled to 50mm. Then we have the 38NA, which is a heavily redesigned prototype variant with an improved turret and with a significantly upgraded engine, giving it excellent mobility. The problem with both of these vehicles is that they still use the little 37mm pea shooter, which is really only even usable in down tiers. Honestly guys, I'll just tell you up front, there's basically no reason to play either of these, as whatever upgrades they might have received, it just doesn't compensate for the fact that their firepower is hopelessly obsolete for the BR, and other vehicles in this lineup can do literally everything better. And speaking of doing everything better, next up we have the Panzer III J. This is similar to the earlier Panzer III F, but with its whole armor reinforced to 50mm. Even with all the extra armor, it's still nearly as fast as the 38NA while possessing a much punchier 50mm main gun. And even though this is the same gun used by the earlier F version, I find that it still works great at this battle rating, while the added protection allows you to play significantly more aggressively and make much better use out of your firepower and mobility. Next is your SPA for the lineup, the Sd.Kfz 6/2. This is basically a half track with a 37mm autocannon strapped to the back, which gets an ATE shell big enough to evaporate small aircraft in a single shot, and also an APHE shell, which can be quite effective at killing ground targets in down tiers. Next up is a much more useful upgrade of those old Panzer 38s, the Marder III, which has its turret chopped off and replaced by a giant 76mm field gun. This will be able to easily one-shot just about anything you encounter, though do note your mobility and gun handling are going to be a bit sucky. And lastly, we get our first variant of the famous StuG series, the StuG 3A. This vehicle gets that same short 75mm we've been seeing, mounted on a casemate on a Panzer III chassis. Though it loses its turret, this vehicle is quite mobile, well armored, and has insane levels of damage output thanks to its high pen and fast reload. Looking at aircraft, we don't have a lot of options, but the ones we do have are quite good. First, we have two versions of the Bf-109E, the E1 and the E3. Both are quite good fighters for the BR and can bring either a single 250kg bomb or 4 50kg bombs for killing ground units. The main difference between the E1 and the E3 is that the E1 has 4 machine guns and the E3 has 2 machine guns and 2 cannons. I personally prefer the E3 with the cannons, but these have a lot less overall trigger time, so some may prefer to just have the all machine gun armament so that they can spray and pray without concerning themselves with ammo. The other aircraft we have available is the HS-129B2. This is similar to the B3, but is seemingly less impressive as it replaces the big 75mm cannon with either a 30 or a 37mm cannon, though they do add 2 20mm cannons to the fuselage, which are great for killing light targets. In practice though, this actually makes this aircraft much more lethal since it will be less weighed down and will have a lot more trigger time overall. My recommendation would be the 30mm cannon loaded with stealth belts. The API rounds in the stealth belts have much better pen against angled armor than even the HVAP rounds found on the 37mm cannon, and do a lot more post-penetration damage than the HVAP does. The 30mm also has a huge magazine size of 100 rounds, making it a literal 1-to-1 equivalent of the A-10 Warthog in low tier. This is one of my favorite CAS aircraft in the whole game, and has enough firepower to wipe out literally the entire enemy team if left unchecked. In terms of playstyle for the lineup overall, the Panzer III, the Marder, and the StuG will be your primary first spawns. The Panzer III can perform well in just about any environment, while the Marder and the StuG can be better situationally. The Marder is just an absolute lull pen machine, and on open maps it will be able to frontally one-shot just about any vehicle it encounters, even at very extreme distances. The StuG meanwhile excels on urban maps, where its insane damage output will allow it to rapidly eliminate large groups of enemies if it can get the drop on them. The Panzer 38s are already second spawns, but again, the Panzer III will be a better option most of the time. If you get enough points to bring in air support, the HS-129 has the ability to single-handedly turn the tide of the match by itself, but just remember, it's quite vulnerable to enemy aircraft as it's slow and lacks any defensive armament. For that reason, I would generally spawn either the 109 or your SPAA first, unless your team already has a bunch of fighters up. Overall, 2.3 is an extremely stacked lineup, which I can definitely recommend you not skip. 2.7 is a lineup which isn't quite as fleshed out as some of the previous, but the vehicles it does have are incredibly strong, at least other than this first one. Starting off, we have the P204. This is a captured French armored car with a long 50mm gun strapped to it. The one really notable thing about this vehicle is that it's the first vehicle in the tech tree to get scouting, if I'm not mistaken. If you're totally new to the game, this basically means it can tag targets for your teammates, putting a red chevron over their head on your team's HUD and lighting them up on the minimap. If a teammate kills this target, you get some extra points, and also a discount on spawning an aircraft if you have the airstrike modification unlocked. The main gun is also quite punchy, but otherwise you aren't super well protected, and this chassis basically has asthma and will struggle to climb even very shallow inclines, though downhill it can go quite fast. The main workhorse of this lineup will be the Panzer III J1. This is similar to the earlier Panzer III J, but with the same longer barreled 50mm gun as the P204, which with over 100mm of flat pen, will be able to easily frontally penetrate most vehicles you encounter. I will mention though, at this battle rating you're going to start encountering vehicles like the M3 and the M4, which have a lot more internal volume, so be prepared to hit them with a follow-up shot or two to finish off all the crew, since veteran crews will tend to have enough health to survive that bursting charge at least once. Moving on to aircraft, first for your fighter you have the Bf-109 F1. This has a better engine than the earlier E versions, giving you superior flight performance, and has a single 20mm cannon firing through the nose, meaning it has slightly less firepower than the earlier E3. Once again, your ordnance options are either one 250kg bomb or 4 50kg bombs on the center line. If you're newer, I would take the 250, but if you have more experience, 50kg bombs are still plenty capable of killing tanks around this BR, plus will give you more drops. And on to CAS, you have a number of different options, including 2 heavy fighters, the Bf-110C7 and the Me-410A1, which are armed with 2 500kg bombs and 50mm autocannon respectively, but just like 2.3, there's one aircraft which I think is the clear standout, and that's the C-3604. This is a Swiss aircraft, which for armament gets 3 high-velocity 20mm cannons, which can easily pen the top armor of most tanks you encounter at this BR, as well as 16 80mm shape charge rockets, which are high velocity and can penetrate up to 300mm of armor. Learning to aim these can take some getting used to, but if you can master it, you'll be able to snipe open-top SPAA from quite a distance, as well as melt through the armor of even Kv2 should you get up-tiered against them. This aircraft also has maneuverability on par with many fighters, which will definitely help you defend yourself, though do note its engine is a bit underpowered and its rudders feel extremely weak, so you may want to avoid entering dogfights if you don't already have an energy advantage. For this lineup, the Panzer III J1 is going to be your best bet for your first spawn in most cases, unless you get put on any sort of open map with a good observation spot where you feel like you can get more mileage out of spotting people compared to the other advantages the Panzer III brings along. In that case, bring the armored car. Otherwise, your primary objective will be to just get enough points to spawn in the C-3604, because as you've probably seen in the background footage, that thing is absolutely obscene at killing ground targets and almost feels like it was designed specifically just to be good in War Thunder ground RB. So from 3.0 onwards, you're going to start seeing many cases where variants of 2 different fighter lines, the BF-109 and the FW-190, are both available at the same battle rating. So I thought I'd take a minute to clear up the differences between these two to hopefully help you figure out which of them is going to better fit your playstyle. Also, for the 109s, this information is mostly just relevant to the F-Series 109s and onwards, since with the earlier versions, you can still kind of get away with just brain-dead turn fighting and still do fine. Anyways, generally speaking, BF-109s are going to be better low-altitude turn fighters than the FW-190s, but the 190s have better energy retention. In fact, both of these aircraft have very good energy retention, especially in the vertical, but the FW-190 is basically top of its class in that department, being able to achieve extremely high speeds in a dive and losing very little of the speed when climbing back up after a boom and zoom attack. This makes the FW-190 probably one of the best prop fighters for energy fighting in the game. The 190s are also generally more heavily armed than the 109s of an equivalent battle rating. The downside is that the 190s also turn quite poorly at lower speeds, which is quite a problem if you ever get caught at low altitude by an enemy in a higher energy state. With both of these aircraft, I would actually recommend playing the same way. Fly between 1,000 and 2,000 meters in altitude, crossing back and forth across the center of the map, keeping an eye out for enemy aircraft spawning in. Most enemies will start diving towards the battle area right off the bat, giving you an opportunity to ambush them, and if you don't kill them immediately, you can always follow up with more boom and zoom attacks. Also, if you see multiple enemies spawning in at the same time, always hit the one in the back of the pack first. If you hit the one in front, the ones behind him will usually see what you're doing and will probably get on your ass and kill you. In the past, I've mostly used 109s in ground RB, which I do usually run with gun pods, by the way, since you're going to be dealing with a lot of very large and tanky bombers and attack aircraft, but lately the 190s have been really growing on me. Overall, I think the 109s are probably going to be more noob-friendly due to them being more of a jack of all trades, but if you have a lot of experience with prop aircraft, I think overall you can make more out of the 190 airframe thanks to its outstanding energy retention. Moving on to 3.0, we start off with the Panzer III L, which is very similar to the earlier J1, but with further reinforced frontal armor. It's also fairly mobile, but while the fast-firing 50mm is still quite decent, you're going to feel it start to struggle a bit when engaging enemies head-on. We also have the Marder 3H. This vehicle is similar to the earlier Marder 3, but with a slightly better gun, slightly better protection on its superstructure, and better gun depression. Even though these are only marginal improvements, this vehicle is still extremely effective as a sniper for this battle rating, being able to one-shot even heavily armored opponents from extreme distances. And lastly, for our ground vehicles, we have the Sturmhaubitze 42G. This is similar to the StuG family of vehicles, except that it mounts a 105mm howitzer. The best shell for this, in my opinion, is the heat shell, which can pan up to 115mm of armor, but carries enough high explosive to overpressure even many medium tanks. The StuH is the first vehicle in the German tech tree which I would say has heavy enough armor that you can reliably brawl with it. People unfamiliar with its weak spots will have a very difficult time penning it frontally, especially since only one shot from its massive main gun can vaporize all but the heaviest opponents. There are also quite a few new aircraft to choose from at this battle rating. You have 2 more BF-109 variants to choose from, the F2 and the E4. The F series introduces a more aerodynamic design over the E series, allowing for a higher top speed, but the F2 is also heavier and packs less firepower while using the same engine, so in ground RB the E4 is definitely going to be the better choice. You also get your first variant of the FW190, which, in case you skipped my little blurb about that, is not quite as maneuverable as the 109, but has outstanding energy retention plus 4 light machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. If you manage to drag someone into a dogfight who's in a lower energy state and you know what you're doing, they can basically kiss their ass goodbye. As for attack aircraft, you have a lot of different options, including 2 heavy fighters, 1 armed with bombs and 1 with a 50mm cannon. You also have the HE-111 H-16, which is basically a low-tier PE-8 armed with a 2,500 kilogram bomb. That aircraft is particularly effective on urban maps where you can target large groups of enemies bunched up at choke points. In most cases, though, I find the most practical option for this BR to be the Ju-88A4. This is similar to the early A1 model, but with better engines, better defensive armament, as well as armor plating around the crew compartment. Again, turn off autopilot for gunner and bomb sight modes, and you can basically use the bomb sight as a pseudo-bomb CCIP. And with up to 4 drops, this aircraft can inflict quite a bit of damage. 3.0 is a lineup with some very strong specialist vehicles, with the Marder 3H being able to win long-range gunnery duels with just about any enemy you might encounter, and the StuH being outstanding for close quarters combat. For open maps, the Marder is the easy choice, whereas in tighter urban maps, the StuH is great for getting in the enemy's face and brawling. When in doubt, the Panzer III is good at just about everything and makes for a good second spawn for the other two. And if you need to either clear the sky of enemy casts or call in air support, you have extremely good options for either task. Now we move on to 3.3. Admittedly, we've been pretty spoiled by these lineups up to this point, but this is where we hit a bit of a speed bump. None of these vehicles are at all bad, but the problem is this lineup gets sucked into nearly constant full up tiers, where we fight some very scary things like Shermans, T-34s, and even KV-1s. It won't be very long until all of those vehicles are nothing but XP pinatas to us, but for now, we're going to have to be a bit wary. Starting off, we have the ultimate variant of the Panzer III, the Panzer III M. In addition to the reinforced frontal armor protection we got on the L variant of this tank, the M also introduces spaced armor skirts around the hull sides and turret, as well as a roof-mounted MG. This vehicle is not by any means bad for its BR, but like I mentioned earlier, you're going to be getting nearly constant up tiers where this 50mm gun is just not going to cut it anymore. Luckily, we do have 2 other medium tanks which partially solve this problem, the Panzer IV F2 and G. These tanks both get access to the L43 75mm gun, which is still quite potent even in an up tier. The problem is they're both glass cannons with only 50mm of flat turret armor. The main difference between the two are that the G gets some extra 30mm armor plates on the whole front and gets some proper smoke grenade launchers on the turret. The extra weight does cause it to be a bit less mobile, but that trade-off is absolutely worth it in my opinion. Next we have the StuG F. To be honest, I'm a bit confused as to why this vehicle isn't a 3.0, because it has the same gun as the Panzer IVs while also losing the turret and not getting the reinforced armor of the earlier Sturmpanzer. Maybe I'm missing something, but I'm not sure why you would ever use this over the Panzer IVs, at least in the context of War Thunder. So I know 3.3 isn't looking too hot so far, but while this lineup may not be the best if played conventionally, it does have 2 vehicles which can be quite fun if played incorrectly. First we have the Sd.Kfz 251. This is basically a half-track with 3 15mm machine guns mounted to the top. Against aircraft, it's kind of mid, I find. A lot of these aircraft you encounter around this BR, like P-47s and IL-2s, are built like flying tanks, and especially at long distance, heavy machine guns just aren't going to cut it. However, with the HVAP belts, these 15mm can absolutely shred light vehicles, and even penetrate heavier tanks like Shermans from the sides. If you can exploit this vehicle's mobility to get in behind people, you can end up causing quite a bit of havoc. That being said, the next SPAA you unlock will be even better for this. This is the Ostwind, and basically it's a Panzer IV chassis with a 37mm autocannon on top. Said autocannon gets access to an APHE shell, which doesn't have a ton of pen, but does much more post-penetration damage than those 15mm do. Again, if you can get in behind the enemy team with this vehicle, you can absolutely obliterate people from the sides and rear, and also, unlike the 251, this thing is actually pretty deadly against aircraft. That's because it gets access to a Mediengeschoss shell with over 100 grams of high explosive filler. This will easily cripple most aircraft in a single hit. This makes the Ostwind a very fun anti-everything vehicle. There's also a new heavy fighter this BR, the Me-410A1, which carries bombs, but I still prefer the same aircraft from 3.0 to be honest. Overall, I think this is a pretty skippable lineup, but if you are determined to play it, the Panzer IV-G is going to be your primary first spawn, since the Panzer III just doesn't have sufficient firepower, and the F2 just functionally is a downgrade due to having less hull armor. The Panzer III might theoretically be the best vehicle in this lineup to use in a down tier due to actually having better armor plus a higher rate of fire, but since you're pretty much never going to get any down tiers, that's more of just a hypothetical. The Ostwind makes for a fantastic second or third spawn though, given its ability to destroy basically anything it encounters, and machine gunning people with that autocannon really just doesn't get old. Moving on to 3.7, we start off with the Puma. This is a wheeled light tank armed with a long 50mm gun, which is obviously highly mobile and actually surprisingly well armored considering what it is. This is a vehicle you'll probably be seeing in matches from now all the way into top tier, just due to its insane mobility and the ability of its main gun to punch through the side armor of even later main battle tanks, making it a good vehicle to use to get the God Mode achievement and the huge SL reward that comes with it. At this BR, I wouldn't say it's overwhelmingly powerful, but it's still a strong scout vehicle which can even deal with heavy tanks frontally if you're able to hit their weak points, and it's just a fun vehicle in general to play for entertainment. Next up, we have the Fat Max. This is a very lightly armored tank destroyer slash assault gun, which, living up to its name, is not particularly mobile, but is able to make up for these shortcomings thanks to its incredible firepower. The actual intended role of this vehicle was to be a mobile bunker buster used to blow apart concrete fortifications on the Maginot Line. Because of this, the armor of most tanks of this BR might as well be made out of wet tissue paper for what good it will do against the Dicker Max's 105mm APHE shell. Even heavy tanks like the KV-1 and the Churchill will be easily frontally one-shot by this thing, not just because of the great penetration, but also the massive bursting charge on its APHE shells. It also features an excellent 15 degrees of gun depression, making it great on uneven terrain. Next, we have two more versions of the Panzer IV, the Panzer IV-H and the Panzer IV-J. Compared to the 3.3 Panzer IVs, these two feature a slightly longer barreled 75mm gun, as well as additional add-on armor and roof-mounted machine guns, though this is all going to increase their weight. Also, something important to keep in mind, despite having a later designation, the J is actually a simplified Panzer IV meant for ease of production, resulting in substantially worse turret rotation speed, and also it has worse add-on armor coverage, so I would generally recommend running the H variant and using the J as a backup. There's also another sort of Panzer IV variant, yet another SPAA built on its chassis, the Wirbelwind. This vehicle features quadruple 20mm cannons mounted in an armored, though still open-top mounting, and does have HVAP rounds, though these are starting to get pretty limited in their effect on ground targets at this point. I would still recommend running the HVAP belts though, because the 20mm HE shells are just not going to do that much damage against many of the very tanky aircraft you may encounter around this BR, while HVAP on the other hand can easily one-shot both pilots and engines if you can land a hit. And lastly, a premium vehicle which I would highly recommend, just simply because it's a lot of fun, is the captured German KV-2, which is a rank 3 by the way, so it can grind events. This is basically identical to the KV-2 1940 in the Soviet tech tree, just with the German commander's cupola stuck to the top. In real life, the cupola was a very useful addition, but in War Thunder, this does sort of just act as an extra weak spot. However, I would still describe this vehicle as an upgrade over the Soviet variant, just because it doesn't face German guns nearly as often. What I mean by this is that while Panzer IVs can easily penetrate the front of Soviet KV tanks, Shermans and T-34s are going to struggle a lot more, meaning you'll have more of an armor advantage over the enemies you most commonly fight than the Soviet version does. Also, pro tip, use the HE shell. Due to having over 45mm of HE penetration, it will be able to punch clean through the front of both Shermans and T-34s with just explosive damage, and with heavier vehicles, you can still overpressure them by hitting the turret face and blowing down through the hull's top armor. Now moving on to aircraft, there are 3 more heavy fighters at this BR, each with a pair of 500kg bombs, as well as some captured fighters you can buy for GE, but honestly, I don't really find any of these to be particularly noteworthy. However, there is one aircraft which is an admittedly quite rare event vehicle, but I just couldn't skip it, the BV-155. I'll mention that there's a very high chance that this vehicle will be available in a future battle pass, since recent seasons have featured a reward crate containing coupons for mid-tier vehicles from previous seasons. Anyways, this is a prototype interceptor whose massive wings were designed to give it enough lift to climb to incredibly high altitudes to intercept American B-29s, but ironically, it also works quite well doing the exact opposite of what it was designed for. Thanks to the amount of lift these wings generate, this fighter is actually extremely maneuverable at low altitude, making it an excellent turn fighter. though the wings also result in a very bad roll rate. It also has one 30mm and two 20mm autocannons with Mine-Geschoss rounds, which will absolutely evaporate both aircraft and light ground targets. It's also a rank 3 and an event vehicle, so again, if you spawn it in, your score from the match will count towards events. This is a very funny aircraft, and if you have some way to obtain it, which doesn't involve paying a ridiculous price in the marketplace, this is a must-have for any German main who likes playing World War II vehicles. For this lineup overall, the Panzer IV is going to be your primary first spawn, being decent at basically everything, but being especially strong in terms of firepower. On open maps though, the Puma can be good for rushing out to strong defensive positions early on and disrupting the enemy advance out of their spawn. For open maps with hilly and uneven terrain, the Dicker Max can also be a fantastic option, since its gun depression will allow it to take advantage of positions which would be unusable to normal vehicles. Just be aware that because it's open-topped and rather sluggish, it's very vulnerable to both aircraft and artillery. If you do get the KV-2, this vehicle is actually a lot more versatile than you might expect, but it's most useful as a support vehicle. I like to stick behind or to the side of my teammates and then pick off enemies one by one while ducking back into cover to reload. Assuming you don't fork over the money to buy any of those fighters, the Wirbelwind is still a particularly menacing SPAA for keeping the skies clear, since even though its range is a bit limited, its sheer volume of fire is incredibly dangerous to anyone who gets close. Now we have 4.0, which is just a straight tank destroyer lineup. There is also a premium Churchill heavy tank available, but I'm going to specifically recommend you not buy it because it has bad mobility, terrible post-pen damage, and its armor is decent but not good enough to rely on. And speaking of which, while playing the German Churchill is bad enough, it must suck even worse to play the British one because that has to fight this thing. This is the Sturer Emil, which is basically a giant open box with a lawnmower engine mounting a ludicrously powerful 128mm gun. This thing will lull pen just about any vehicle it encounters, and with a bursting charge of nearly 800 grams, any penetrating hit will instantly overpressure the crew. Its mobility is quite poor, though like the Fat Max, it does get a very nice 15 degrees of gun depression. Next we have, forget the long designation, I'm just going to call it the Flak bus. This is basically a heavy half-track with a bunch of armor plates bolted onto it and a fast-firing 88mm anti-aircraft gun mounted on the back. This thing has so many drawbacks that it would be faster to list off what isn't a problem. However, the few positive characteristics this vehicle does have are actually very strong. For one, it has a 5-second reload, which is blisteringly fast for such a powerful gun at this BR. Its APHE shell has a very powerful bursting charge, which will lead to consistent one-shots, and also it has a rangefinder, which makes it excellent for sniping. Next we get to an actual proper armored vehicle, the StuG 3G. This vehicle has the same reinforced armor layout as the earlier Sturmhaubitz, along with a L48 75mm gun, similar to the one introduced to us on the 3.7 Panzer IVs. It's not the speediest vehicle ever, but that combination of thick armor and powerful gun on a very small silhouette make it a pretty tough and versatile tank destroyer. Just be cautious when advancing, since obviously you lack a turret, so if you get disabled, you can only fire at what's directly in front of you. And lastly, for ground vehicles, we have the M44 and M55. I'm lumping these together since they fill essentially the same role. These are both lightly armored, mobile derp guns, copy-pasted from the US tech tree, with the 55 getting a bigger gun in return for a longer reload. To be honest, I don't really find either of these to be very practical. Yeah, they can be kind of funny, but they're more so novelty items than actually competitive vehicles in my opinion. They're not very survivable, and their slow reload speed is a serious handicap, so I don't think you're missing much by skipping them. And moving on to aircraft at this BR, we first have the Bf-109 F4. Compared to the earlier F2, this aircraft gets a substantially more powerful engine, replaces the 15mm cannon in the prop hub with a more powerful 20mm cannon, and gives you some additional ordnance options. You can also bring along a pair of wing-mounted 15mm gun pods for some extra punch, which I typically would, since you're going to be fighting things like P-47s and IL-2s, which are going to be very resistant to damage. There's also a tropicalized version in the tech tree at the same battle rating, but the only difference as far as I know is that that one has an anti-sand filter in the air intake, which marginally reduces engine performance, but is otherwise identical. There are also two different FW190 variants, the A4 and the A5U2. These both have more powerful engines than the earlier A1 and are largely identical to one another, with both having two 20mm MG151s in the wing roots, which give them quite a substantial amount of punch. The main difference is that the A4 gets an extra pair of light machine guns and smaller MGFF cannons as additional armament, whereas the A5U2 can carry a 500 kg bomb. I don't really like to use these for ground pounding anyways, so I tend to prefer the A4 for the additional firepower. Though your 4.0 lineup may not have any actual tanks in it, this is still going to be a reasonably versatile lineup, with the StuG being able to fill the role of your do-everything sort of vehicle, and the Emil and the Flak bus being more specialized. The Emil, with its great gun depression, is most effective on hilly maps with long lines of sight, where it can place itself in steep embankments normal vehicles will be unable to fire over, and use its overwhelmingly powerful gun to destroy any enemy it encounters. The Flak bus, meanwhile, is best for either urban maps or very large open maps. On urban maps, its height can actually play to its advantage, since it can park itself behind tall barricades and fire on enemies who may think nobody has line of sight on them. And on very large maps, its lack of gun depression doesn't really matter as much, and with its rangefinder, you can pick people off from very extreme distances. Both the 190s and the 109 you get are all great for the BR, just be aware that these can't turn as tightly as some of the enemies they face, especially Zeros and Yak 3s, so make sure to use vertical loops and spiral climbs to make the most out of their energy retention. So on its own, 4.3 might appear like a pretty weak lineup since you only get a pair of tank destroyers in the tech tree. However, there are a couple of premium vehicles and CAS aircraft which will make this lineup incredibly strong. Starting off with the tech tree vehicles, first we have the Jagdpanzer IV. This is very similar in terms of function to the earlier StuG 3G, but with the chassis being that of a Panzer IV instead of a Panzer III, and with a casemate layout which provides both better gun depression and also fewer weak spots. Like the StuG before it, this is a reasonably mobile and very well armed and armored tank destroyer, which on open maps is going to have an absolute field day when fighting medium or heavy tanks of a comparable battle rating. We also have a fan favorite, the Jagdpanzer 38, better known as the Hetzer. Again, like the StuG and the Jagdpanzer IV, it has a 75mm gun mounted in a casemate, except in this case the chassis is that of a Panzer 38. While it may look very similar to the Jagdpanzer IV, there are actually a couple of subtle differences between the two, which will mean they're actually much better suited to two different specializations, but we'll touch more on that once we get to the strategy section. Next we have yet another Panzer IV based tank destroyer, the Brummbär. This vehicle mounts an enormous 150mm low velocity cannon, and unlike the American copy-paste derp guns, this vehicle is actually extremely well protected, featuring a sloped 100mm armor plate which will stop all but the heaviest cannons from penetrating it frontally. Do note though that this cannon has very low velocity, so this vehicle is best used within very short engagement distances. Also, it does get two types of shells, a normal high explosive shell and a heat shell, and both can work, but I typically prefer the HE shell, mainly because the heat shell fails to exceed the 45mm of explosive penetration threshold, which means you can't just insta-kill T-34s with overpressure. And now we have some premium captured Russian vehicles. The first is the T-34 747. This is basically a late model T-34-76 with the addition of add-on hull armor similar to that of the T-34E, plus some extra track armor on the sides. Like all T-34s, this vehicle strikes a great balance between armor, mobility, and firepower, and this one in particular benefits enormously from not having to fight German guns, making it arguably the best T-34 for its BR in the entire game. It absolutely pales in comparison to the absolute juggernaut of a tank we'll talk about next, the Kv-1B. The Kv-1B is a strong contender for being the single most OP vehicle ever added to the game upon release. The BMPT Terminator might beat it out, but that's only because it was deliberately added with a bugged ammo rack on launch in order to sell more of them. The Kv-1B has side armor as thick as a Tiger 1's front armor, and it sits at 4.3, and it used to sit at 4.0. Now, to be fair, it is just a copy-paste of the Soviet premium Kv-1E, just having been captured by the Finns and given a different paint job, but again, it doesn't fight German guns, which means a lot of the vehicles you face will literally only be able to penetrate you if they're firing from point-blank range at a perfectly flat angle at one of a very small number of difficult-to-hit weak spots. While this vehicle is rather expensive on the marketplace, it has been available for free before in the War Bond shop, which is how I got it. And it's also a vehicle which can occasionally drop from loot crates, so if you got one and you're on the fence about whether you should sell it or not, this is your sign, definitely keep it. Starting on aircraft, first we have the Bf-109G2. This is another incremental upgrade of the 109 series with a bit more horsepower than the F4 and also getting access to 20mm wing-mounted cannon pods, which will help further increase its punch over the 15mm ones found on the F4. We also have two new versions of the FW-190, including the regular A5 and the A5U12, which gets the funny ability to carry double 20mm cannon pods in each wing. I of course like to use the U12 because having a comical amount of burst mass to bully enemy CAS with is always very entertaining. You have a couple different options for CAS, but there are two I would consider to be most notable. The first is the Dornier 335A1. This is a twin-engine fighter bomber with unique push-pull design, which gets a high-velocity 30mm cannon firing through the prop hub, plus a number of bombs. The Dornier is an extremely versatile multi-role fighter capable of hunting enemy aircraft, destroying ground targets with bombs, and using its 30mm cannon to shred armored targets. I personally prefer stealth belts for the 30mm for the better angled pen and post-pen damage, and armored target belts for the 15mm. Also, due to the push-pull layout, the engines tend to eat up a lot of the shots which would normally kill the pilot, and since both engines are mounted centerline and not off to one side, flying home on one engine is very, very easy. The other option is a premium aircraft which occasionally goes on sale for Golden Eagles, the HE-219. This is supposed to be a heavy night fighter for intercepting bombers, but with two high-velocity 30mm cannons with 100 rounds each, plus two 20mm and two low-velocity Mk108s, this thing is basically an A-10 Warthog. It also has surprisingly good maneuverability for such a large aircraft, and outside of ground RB, this thing is fantastic for grinding Silver Lions in air RB due to the crazy number of ground targets you can kill with it. If you see it on sale, I absolutely recommend it. In terms of how you play this lineup, assuming you don't have any of the premiums, the Hetzer is going to lend itself better to urban maps, whereas the Jagdpanzer will work better on open maps. This is because the Jagdpanzer has a bit better mobility and gun depression, whereas the Hetzer has more heavily sloped armor and also lacks any true frontal weak spots. Do be careful about its extremely thin side armor though. If you have it, the Brummbär may also be an even better option for extremely tight urban maps. The premium captured Russian tanks, meanwhile, are both best used to exploit down tiers. The KV-1B in particular is basically the E100 of its BR range and would be printing nukes left and right if you could actually get them at this BR. You may prefer the T-34 on more open maps though, since it has better mobility and firepower, and these lend themselves better to those situations. Beyond that, even if you die, you have some great options both in terms of fighters and CAS, whatever the situation calls for. Overall, I think 4.3 is a fantastic lineup, especially if you splurge on some of the premiums. I would absolutely recommend. So Germany actually has no 4.7 tech tree ground vehicles and only has one 5.0, so I'm going to lump some premiums into this lineup just so we actually have something to talk about here. Also, there are some absolutely banger aircraft in this lineup, so stay tuned for those. The one tech tree vehicle you do get is the VK3002M, which is essentially just a prototype Panther with thinner armor, but in turn a much better power to weight ratio than the production Panthers. It does have extremely slow turret traverse and a bad reverse gear though. One sort of hidden strength of this vehicle is that if you bush it up and run it with a camo that isn't the default, it's not very easy to tell at a glance that this thing isn't just a normal Panther, and that seems to cause some people to hesitate when taking shots at it, even if their guns were easily strong enough to penetrate you. The first of the two premiums I'll talk about is the KV-1C. This is a modified version of the KV-1 with a German L48 75mm gun in the turret. To be honest, I'm not sure this vehicle should be sat at such a high BR, since neither its gun nor its armor are really that impressive, especially for a heavy tank, and in up tiers especially, it suffers a lot. It can be really great in down tiers though. And lastly, we have the famous Pakwagon. This is a go-kart with a 75mm long-barreled anti-tank gun strapped to it, which makes for a combination that is about as hilarious as you would expect it to be, since you can rush into position right at the start of the match and then frontally penetrate almost anything you encounter. I'm sure you've also seen plenty of memes of this thing killing Abrams and T-80s, and yes, this is a great vehicle for getting the God mode achievement also. If you ever find yourself getting a coupon for one of these things through a crate or see one available in a future Warbond shop, this one is definitely a keeper. For fighters, first we have the Bf-109G6. This is yet another incremental upgrade of the 109 series, with this one perhaps being most notable for getting its LMGs replaced with lightweight 13mm machine guns instead. Do note that these don't punch quite as hard as the American 50 cals, so your MG151s are still going to be your primary damage output. We also have 4 different versions of the FW190, including 2 of the new FW190Ds, which feature Yokosumo 213 inline engines instead of the BMW radial engines of the A series. While I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because I feel like there's a better option, which I'll talk about here in a minute, I should mention that one of these FW190s is the 190F, an attack variant which gets some very interesting ordnance options, including 2 keyboard-guided air-to-air missiles, which I have seen some players use to snipe enemy SPAA from long distance. My personal preference of these, though, is the D9, partially because it has a bunch of really cool camos, but also because, assuming the wiki isn't lying to me, I believe it has the best power to weight ratio of any of these variants. If I'm wrong, please personally attack me in the comments below. My preferred attacker for this lineup is the ME410 B6R3, and this is yet another vehicle which is basically a low-tier A10. You get two high-velocity 30mm cannons with plenty of ammunition, and again, use AP belts, not HVAP belts, for better post-pen damage, and thanks to an airframe which is relatively nimble for a heavy fighter, it's not too shabby against aircraft either. So assuming you aren't running this lineup with just the Proto-Panther and the tech tree, the short version of how to run this lineup is run the KV-1C in down tiers to take advantage of the better armor and to compensate for the honestly kind of mediocre firepower, and run the Proto-Panther in up tiers to take advantage of that great cannon and use it cautiously like a light armored tank destroyer. With the Pakwagon, meanwhile, assuming you're fortunate enough to own it, it's best used in certain cases where you need to race the enemy team to advantageous positions or where you can rush out and flank the enemy early on. The background gameplay is definitely a good example of that first case. Overall, though, it's really the aircraft that are the biggest standouts of this lineup in my opinion, as you have some absolutely outstanding options for both fighters and attackers. Honestly, I would give all of them a try just to see which one you prefer, because in my opinion, really all of them are quite fun. Now on to 5.3, where we finally start to see some of the real big ticket items and also a few less well-known vehicles, which I would argue are actually some of the strongest in the lineup. First, we have our first proper Panther, the Panther D. Compared to the prototype, the production Panther has significantly thicker armor, which is going to help you be a hell of a lot more survivable. This also makes it a good deal heavier and more sluggish though, which combined with its bad reverse gear, slow turret reverse, and weak side armor makes this vehicle a pretty poor choice for urban combat. On the other hand, in open terrain in a head-to-head gunnery duel, this vehicle will absolutely wipe the floor with basically any Allied or Soviet tanks it encounters, thanks to its trolley armor, its high internal volume which will help it absorb penetrating hits, and of course its very high velocity, high penning cannon. In case the penetration of the L70 75mm cannon on the Panther isn't enough for you, don't worry, because this next option will take you straight into lolpen territory. This is of course our next iteration in the German open-top line, the Nashorn. Though it has mediocre mobility, terrible armor, and only 5 degrees of gun depression, the Nashorn gets access to the dreaded long 88mm gun, which can frontally penetrate pretty much any enemy tank you might encounter in this vehicle, even out to very extreme ranges. Also has a very high magnification optic, which is incredibly useful when combined with a Luchs sight or any others like it. And rounding out our tech tree vehicles, we have the Ostwind 2, which is mostly the same as the original Ostwind, it just has 2 barrels. Due to sitting at a higher BR, this Ostwind won't be nearly as good at killing ground targets, but thanks to having double the firepower of the original, it makes for a fantastic SPAA, with its 37mm HE rounds still being more than powerful enough to get the job done. Lastly, for the ground vehicles, I have one premium I'd like to mention, and that's the VK4501. This is basically a prototype of the Rank 4 GE Premium Porsche Tiger, but at 1 BR notch lower and without those extra 100mm armor plates stuck to the front. This is currently the lowest BR Tiger in the game, but also probably the worst in absolute terms. It's probably not the worst for its BR though, since 5.3 actually sees a lot of down tiers. Its biggest drawback is that it has flattened 80mm hull corners, which prevent it from angling effectively like the production Tigers, and it also has very slow turret reverse. However, like the later Tigers, it still gets access to an incredibly powerful HE shell, which has over a 200-gram bursting charge, meaning it will easily one-shot anything it penetrates. This vehicle is one of the most common vehicle drops from camo trophies and is also not terribly expensive on the marketplace if you want to sell some event vehicles for it. We also get a new 109 variant. This is the 109 G14. Now, the implementation of this aircraft is apparently an almost decade-long controversy because my understanding is the one we see in-game has the visual model of an early G14, but with a high-altitude boost system found in the late G14s. So ignoring the mostly BS numbers on the stat card, to the best of my understanding, the short explanation as to the difference between this aircraft and the earlier G6 is that this aircraft has better high-altitude performance and a stronger rudder, in return for marginally worse low-altitude performance. I have no idea why that warrants a full 2 BR notch increase, but maybe someone out there knows something I don't. We also get ourselves a new Schnellbomber, the Ju-188. I like to use a loadout of 2 1,000 kilogram bombs and 2 250 kilogram bombs on this aircraft. which combined with those bomb sight settings I talked about earlier, basically gives you bomb CCIP. Compared to the earlier Ju-88, this thing has stronger engines, better flight performance, and drastically better defensive firepower, including a 20mm MG151 and a fully rotating turret, which can cripple an engine or blow the wing off a single-engine fighter in a single hit. Overall, 5.3 is an extremely versatile and well-balanced lineup, which is especially dangerous on open maps where the Panther and the Nashorn will completely dominate any long-range engagement. Though these vehicles aren't well suited to urban combat, this gap in capability can be filled in by the prototype Porsche Tiger, thanks to it having a bit better all-around protection, a gun which will insta-kill anything it penetrates, which is very important up close, and a much better reverse gear than the Panther. You also have one of the best SPA for its BR in the entire game, so even if you fail to do well engaging ground targets, you can still have a very positive impact for your team with that. Additionally, your fighter and CAS options are also excellent, so you should definitely take full advantage of them if you're in enough spawn points to call them in. Now moving on to 5.7, we find ourselves with a bit of a smaller lineup, but one which contains one of my favorite vehicles in the whole game, the Tiger H1. This is a vehicle which I find to be wildly misunderstood and misused, so please excuse some rambling. Though the Tiger 1 is billed as a heavy tank, it doesn't really work in this role in the context of War Thunder. This is because its flat 100mm front hull armor can be easily penetrated by the guns of even medium tanks at this BR, such as the Sherman and the T-34-85. However, what a lot of people seem to miss about this vehicle is the fact that it actually has very solid mobility and gun handling, and like the VK4501 at 5.3, its 88mm APHE shell has an enormous bursting charge, which means that any vehicle it penetrates, even large heavy tanks, is going to die in one shot. Combined with its relatively high rate of fire, this gives the Tiger probably the highest effective damage output of any vehicle in its class, so if you can manage to slip in behind the enemy team, you can absolutely tear them to pieces. Also worth mentioning about this vehicle is that it has some premium versions which are actually just straight up upgrades of the tech tree version, and no, I'm not talking about the premium Porsche Tiger, which does get extra frontal armor, but this is mostly useless due to having two giant weak spots on the corners, plus inferior mobility and gun handling to the regular H1. Instead, I'm referring to the Tiger Ost and the Tiger West found in the two fronts pack. These vehicles lose the annoying little smoke mortars on the hull corners which interfere with your gun depression and also get some additional add-on armor. This add-on armor is not especially thick, but will provide an additional useful boost to protection to otherwise vulnerable areas, especially the flat parts of the front armor and the upper hull sides in the case of the Ost. This makes the two fronts pack an incredible pickup in my opinion, especially since you also get a premium Ostwind 2 which fits fantastically into the 5.7 lineup. For longer range engagements, we also have the Waffentrager, which, like the Nashorn at 5.3, is a lightly armored open-top tank destroyer mounting the incredibly powerful Long 88, which can punch clean through the front armor of almost any tank you encounter at this BR. Like the Nashorn, it also gets a very high magnification optic, which again works great with the Luchs or the Kw.K sights. Where it improves on the Nashorn is with the fact that it's much smaller, has better gun depression, and also features a fully rotating turret. There's also another tank destroyer option at this battle rating, the Panzer 470, which is basically a Sturmpanzer 4 with an L70 75mm gun like on the Panther. The problem is, at this battle rating, its protection is ineffective, its mobility isn't great, and it has inferior gun handling to either the Waffentrager or the Tiger, which both have fully rotating turrets, so I'm not really sure why you would ever play this thing. We also get two new 109s, the G10 and the K4. You will hear no shortage of debates online about which of these two is better, but the short version is the K4 has a heavier airframe, but a more powerful engine and higher thrust-to-weight ratio, whereas the G10 is a bit lighter and I believe a little bit more nimble at low altitude. For our purposes though, there isn't really going to be a huge difference. In both cases, I use these to jump enemy CAS as they're heading towards the engagement area, and for that purpose, they both work perfectly well. We also get a new version of the Dornier 335, the B2, and while this is a premium, it's one I'd highly recommend since it gets access to 3 high-velocity 30mm cannons, which can absolutely shred through the tops of enemy tanks. Again, I'm using stealth belts, since AP has better angled pen and post-pen damage than the HVAP. A mix of the two would be nice, though. It can also carry a couple of bombs, plus thanks to the push-pull design, your pilot will be very well protected by the engine blocks, and even if one engine gets shot out, you can still easily fly back home. Even though it's not super fleshed out, 5.7 is a fantastic lineup, with the Waffentrager being very dominant for long-range engagements, and the Tiger H1 being a versatile first spawn for everything else. The fact that you can run up to 3 of them if you have the 2 fronts pack also definitely helps. You can also run the 5.3 Ostwind 2 as a second or third spawn vehicle, and it's still incredibly effective at this BR. Your fighter and CAS options are very strong too, though if you don't want to spend the money on the 335, the Ju-188 from 5.3 still works great. Moving on to 6.0, we have a very well flushed out lineup with a lot of big cats. I will firstly mention though that you do get the M109G at this BR, which is a lightly armored derp gun copy-pasted from the American tree, and I'd advise just skipping it. I don't really find it to be effective at much of anything, and you have other options which are better for any given role. The first of these is the Tiger E. This is very similar to the earlier Tiger H1, with the biggest changes being a stronger engine and a less vulnerable commander's cupola, plus slightly better turret traverse speed. Overall, I don't really find that these upgrades make it that much more effective than the regular Tiger H1, and you will get up tiered to 6.7 a lot more than the H1. I did get a nuke in the match in the background footage, but to be honest, nearly every other match I played with this thing, I got my ass kicked. Next, we have the first of 3 different 6.0 Panthers, the Panther A. This vehicle is very similar to the earlier Panther D, except with a slightly revised turret armor scheme and a much faster turret traverse speed, plus some extra track armor around the turret and sides. Other than the faster turret traverse speed though, it doesn't really feel that much different from playing the D, and still has the same weaknesses, most notably poor reverse gear and very weak side armor. Then we have the Panther G. This is sort of a refinement of the A with better optimized armor, where they reduce the thickness of the lower front plate down to 50 from 60 millimeters, and in return increase the thickness of the turret face and the upper hull sides. This is absolutely a worthwhile trade-off, especially since the transmission sits behind the lower front plate anyways, and makes the G essentially just an all-around better version of the A. Again though, those same core deficiencies are not really getting addressed here. And last off, we have the Panther F. This was a very late model Panther which never saw combat, though a handful were in fact built. The main draw of this version of the Panther is its redesigned turret. This turret presents a smaller target area than previous versions, while also offering increased protection thanks to its sloped 120mm turret face. It also features much tankier turret sides and rear, now increased to 60mm from 45mm on earlier versions, plus much thicker top armor on both the turret and the hull. Probably the most impressive feature of this design though is the fact that it gets access to an optical rangefinder. It gets all of these upgrades without any notable increase in weight, by the way. The rangefinder is going to give you an incredible advantage in long-range gunnery duels, and the better optimized armor layout will also make you more survivable. This is the definitive best 6.0 Panther in my opinion. And lastly, for ground vehicles, we have the Zerstorer 45. Basically what we have here are 4 Mk103 30mm cannons mounted in an open quad mount on a Panzer IV chassis. This vehicle is much less well protected than many other German SPAA, but is capable of throwing up an extremely impressive barrage to fire against low-flying aircraft. Moving on to aircraft, for fighters we start off with the TA-152H. This is basically a roided out version of the Dora series FW-190s with very long wings in order to achieve higher altitudes. Like the BV-155 I discussed earlier, these wings also give it quite impressive low altitude maneuverability at the cost of roll rate, so it's actually not a bad low altitude interceptor at all. And for CAS, your best option is going to be the HE-177. Though this is a heavy bomber, it's actually quite nimble for its size and can carry up to 4 giant 1,800 kilogram bombs. There's also the premium Ju-288, which only carries 2 of these bombs, but has even better flight performance. Even though 6.0 is quite fleshed out, the Panther F is really the only vehicle in this lineup which I would describe as being particularly strong for the battle rating, with the rest being rather mediocre, mostly just because 6.0 will see a lot of up tiers. I would still tend to use the Tiger E for shorter range engagements, though with the understanding that it's not really so great for the BR, and the Panther F for any large open maps where you can really make use of that rangefinder. The Z45, the TA-152, and the HE-177 are all decent in their respective roles and definitely offer the ability to keep this lineup in the fight for longer, but again, none of them are really that outstanding. This is really just an okay lineup and definitely not a must-play. So if you thought 6.0 was a bit of a weaker showing, then 6.3 is proof that it can always get worse. Our first vehicle is the Jagdpanther, which was absolutely terrifying in real life, but in War Thunder is very underwhelming. This is because it retains all of the same problems as the original Panther, especially the bad reverse gear and weak side armor, but drags them up to an even higher battle rating. The long 88 is fantastic, don't get me wrong, but its armor is very weak for the battle rating, with common enemies like the IS-2 or American T-34 heavy tank being able to punch right through it. And with only a 13 horsepower per ton power to weight ratio, you aren't exactly going to be zipping around the battlefield either. Your other option is the Jagdpanzer IV, and again, very good vehicle in real life, not so much in War Thunder. You have just enough armor to fuse APHE shells, but not enough to provide any real protection. Mediocre gun depression, plus you have to deal with the extremely inconsistent damage of its 90mm HeatFS shell, plus not having a turret. The only real bright spot for this vehicle is its mobility. It's pretty small and zippy, so if you get to an advantageous position early on and ambush people, you can do some good work, but that's really only going to work especially well if the enemy team you're fighting is half blind like the one in the background footage. We do, however, have some very strong options for aircraft. The first is the TA-152C. This is similar to the H version at 6.0, but with conventional wings, a pretty substantially stronger engine, and a different armament layout. This includes a propeller hub mounted 30mm cannon, which can carry those nice API rounds I keep glazing so much, plus 4 20mm cannons. This allows you to effectively engage ground targets while also having outstanding performance as an energy fighter. And last up, we have the AR-234B2. This is a twin-engine jet bomber with no guns, but up to 3 bomb drops, either 3 500kg bombs or 1 1000kg bomb and 2 250s. By changing the autopilot for gunner and bomb sight mode to no, we can effectively use the bomb sight like bomb CCIP, which combined with its speed makes this an excellent CAS aircraft. If you are, for whatever reason, absolutely determined to play 6.3, the Jagdpanther is going to be better on smaller maps, while the Panzer IV is better on open ones thanks to its mobility, but otherwise, I'll be honest, this one is just very skippable. The aircraft sure are a lot of fun, but if I had a bad time with this lineup while sitting in the top 1% of players in terms of kills per spawn and ground RB, I can't imagine this is going to be enjoyable for you, the viewer. So I know I didn't have much positive to say about those last two lineups, but I think 6.7 is going to comfortably make up for that. In fact, I would say that this is probably one of the best in the entire tech tree, with basically every vehicle in it being exceptionally good in its respective role. The first of these vehicles is the LeKPz M41, and since most vehicles like this tend to be misused a lot, I will quickly shill my guide on light tanks if you want to get some more in-depth information about how I use these types of vehicles. This vehicle may appear to just be a copy-paste of the American version of this tank, but it's actually a substantial upgrade, getting smoke grenades and, more importantly, a HeatFS shell. In this instance, I would definitely recommend taking the heat shells over APDS, since these have significantly better angled penetration and are also great for culling the M18 spam with HE damage. I tend to use this vehicle in cases where either mobility is very important or in up tiers, since these heat shells are still totally viable against 7.7s, plus scouting just makes you inherently up tier proof. This next vehicle is one of the best heavy tanks for its BR in the game, the King Tiger, and there are actually 3 King Tigers at this battle rating. The first of these is the early production Tiger II with the worst turret, sometimes incorrectly referred to as Porsche Tigers. The problem with these is that the turret cheeks are as thin as only 100mm in some areas, allowing them to be easily penetrated by pretty much any high-caliber anti-tank gun you might encounter. The standard production Tiger II, on the other hand, solves this problem thanks to a sloped 185mm armor plate on its turret face, which offers outstanding protection and will make you frontally immune to both the Soviet 85 and American 90mm guns, unless they can get a lucky shot through your MG or Vision ports. The last 6.7 King Tiger is the premium Tiger II SLE 16, aka the Diesel Tiger. This is just a straight upgrade over the tech tree versions, offering added track armor to the sides of your turret and introducing a more powerful 680 horsepower diesel engine, which will massively improve your mobility. What's probably the most outstanding feature of these vehicles is their firepower. The Long 88 is still an incredibly effective weapon even at this BR, having great velocity and post-penetration damage, while having a reload speed nearly twice as fast as many comparable American and Soviet guns, while possessing penetration values which approach 76mm APDS. Combined with your excellent armor, as well as decent mobility and gun handling, the King Tiger is without equal at this battle rating, and the SLA in particular is one of my go-to vehicles for grinding out score for events. Next up we have the Ferdinand, and you may be wondering what the point of using a casemate tank destroyer is when you have the King Tiger at the same BR with the same gun and better mobility, but situationally, the Ferdinand can actually be even better than the King Tiger. This is because the Ferdinand features even thicker armor on its casemate than the King Tiger's turret face, a 200mm plate sloped at 20 degrees to be specific, and also it has a faster ace reload speed of only 6.7 seconds. For this reason, on maps where engagements are going to be restricted to long, narrow lines of sight and you know you're going to be taking a lot of return fire, the Ferdinand may be your best option. There is another tank destroyer available, the Jagdtiger, but I'm going to recommend you skip this one. The 128mm gun only offers about 35mm of extra penetration compared to the long 88, yet has almost 3 times as long a reload, and on that basis alone, it's badly outclassed by the Ferdinand, though its terrible mobility and gun handling don't help it either. I should note that the penetration characteristics of the 128mm in-game are somewhat artificially nerfed at the moment though, in that they don't reflect penetration values when using full power heavy propellant charges, so if that ever gets changed, I might revisit this vehicle since its performance would be more like the 130mm found on the IS-7. And lastly, we have an incredibly powerful SPAA, the Kugelblitz. This SPAA is not just fully enclosed, but actually relatively well armored, making it very difficult to kill with aircraft-mounted cannons and rockets. It also has the ability to engage ground targets, though it hasn't really ever been the same since they removed its full HVAP belts. This is a fantastic second or third spawn vehicle, being highly survivable by SPAA standards, while being able to shred both light ground vehicles and aircraft with its twin 30mm cannons. I tend to find the 50-50 HE API belts are the best for chaotic situations where you're engaging both ground vehicles and aircraft, but play around with it and see what you prefer. And lastly, we wrap up with probably my single favorite CAS aircraft in the entire game, the Narwhal. This is a variant of the Me-262 armed with a 50mm high-velocity cannon carrying 32 rounds of ammunition. Though designed as a bomber-destroyer, this armament makes it unbelievably effective for close air support. My preferred playstyle is to basically boom and zoom the engagement area, cutting left to right across the center of the map. I typically concentrate on single targets per pass, firing 3 to 4 rounds into them before disengaging. Also, pro tip, use your elevator to pull up and down while you're closing into firing range to throw off the aim of SPAA gunners. At this battle rating, many people will still be running prop aircraft, giving you a comically large speed advantage to the point where you can usually just run away from enemy fighters. This airframe is also incredibly tanky, surprisingly, and I regularly get the ever-living crap shot out of me and still manage to limp home to repair and rearm. As for strategy with this lineup, in up tiers, I like to run the M41 as a support vehicle and either try to get enough score so that I can bring in the Narwhal and whittle down the enemy team with that, or if I'm feeling like a try-hard, I run the M41 and then the Kugelblitz to try and earn a nuke. In down tiers, though, the King Tiger and the Ferdinand are absolute menaces. Fighting T-34s and Shermans with a long 88 feels like it should be illegal, and that goes both for tight urban maps as well as large open ones. If I do die and there are a lot of enemy aircraft up, I run the Kugelblitz, and if there aren't, I run the Narwhal. Overall, 6.7 is one of the absolute highlights of this entire tech tree for me. I can promise you from years of playing this game though, as far as actually enjoying the game goes, it's really only downhill from here, unless of course you're one of the lucky individuals who has access to the vehicles of this next lineup. So to be honest, me even talking about this next lineup is kind of mean, since most of these vehicles will most likely never be obtainable again, but they're so bonkers that I couldn't just not talk about them. In case you aren't aware, a few years ago, Gaijin removed several vehicles from the German tech tree which were technically ahistorical. These were the Panther II, the Tiger 10.5cm, and the Flakpanzer. None of these vehicles were actually built in their configurations represented in-game. Though the people who already owned them were allowed to keep them, so far there has been no opportunity presented for new players to unlock them. But before we talk about those vehicles, let's first talk about this hilarious little shitbox, the SPZ-12. This was a reward for a previous Battle Pass season, and while you might think it looks pretty unimpressive, I can assure you, you could not possibly be more wrong. The thing about this vehicle I love to heavily abuse is the recoilless rifle stuck to the back. You can expose this without actually exposing the rest of your vehicle to oncoming fire, and with 17 degrees of gun depression, you can fire from positions which would be unusable for most vehicles. And in this case, the low velocity of its gun is actually a benefit, since this allows you to arc your shots to hit players who are behind cover. On top of that, due to its segmented crew compartment, this vehicle is actually surprisingly survivable. Due to this, combined with its scouting ability, this vehicle has probably gotten me more nukes than any other in the game. Next we have the Panther II. So this vehicle was built, but not in the configuration we see in-game. In real life, the one prototype of this vehicle which was built had a Panther G turret, whereas the one we see here uses a Schmalturm design similar to the one on the Panther F, but which I believe is entirely fictitious. The Panther II has a huge number of upgrades over the 6.0 Panthers, enough so that even at one full BR rating higher, it's probably actually stronger for its BR than those vehicles are. Starting with protection, the Panther II's front hull has increased from a sloped 80mm plate to a sloped 100mm plate, which gives it a pretty substantial bump to protection. The side armor is also increased to 60mm on all areas. In terms of firepower, we swap out the long 75 for a long 88, which gives us a massive boost to firepower as well, and like the Panther F, we do keep that rangefinder. What's probably the most noticeable improvement, though, comes from its mobility. The Panther II swaps out the earlier 600 horsepower engine for a 900 horsepower one, which is going to drastically improve your mobility and take the Panther chassis from being relatively underpowered to actually being quite zippy. We also get a decent reverse gear on this one, which is also very much appreciated. Next up, we have the Tiger II 10.5 centimeter. This vehicle maintains the excellent protection of the tech tree Tiger II, but with a much larger 105mm cannon. The 105mm cannon brings your maximum penetration up to 284mm and increases your bursting charge by about 30%. This is one of the most powerful APHE shells in the entire game, and combined with the rangefinder this vehicle gets, makes this vehicle fantastic for long-range sniping. Like the Panther II, though, there's one last upgrade which you may not notice unless you take a closer look under the hood. And that's the fact that this Tiger gets the same 900 horsepower engine as the Panther II, which makes this the most mobile King Tiger variant in the game, and is helpful both for moving spot to spot, but also for popping in and out of cover on inclines. Also, one other thing I forgot to mention is that this thing gets an extra crew member in the form of a second loader. And lastly, for our 7.0 ground vehicles, we have probably the most batshit insane of all of them, the Flakpanzer 341, better known as the Kw.K. This SPAA features two high-velocity 37mm autocannons mounted on a Panther chassis. The wiki says this is a Panther A chassis, however its armor layout is a bit different than the Panther A, most notably its thicker side armor, so I'm not really sure what's going on there. These 37mm cannons fire two types of rounds: HE rounds, which have higher velocity and almost twice as much explosive filler as 40mm Bofors rounds, I might add, and APHE rounds, which have nearly 90mm of flat pen and more HE filler than 75mm Panzergranat 39. Combined with the fact that this vehicle is fully enclosed in relatively heavy armor, this makes the Kw.K. an absolutely unrivaled anti-everything machine capable of annihilating both ground units and aircraft alike. If you're able to flank the enemy team, God help them, because they're going to need it. Moving on to aircraft, we have yet another semi-ahistorical vehicle, the HO-229. You do also have a version of the 262 that carries bombs, but you'll see in a second why the 229 is a better choice. The HO-229 was real and did fly, but to the best of my knowledge, it was never equipped or even planned to be equipped with the high-velocity MK103s. I'm certainly not complaining though, because in War Thunder, when equipped with the API belts, these things will absolutely shred ground targets. I'll mention again, in case you didn't watch the sections where I mentioned this earlier, but the API belts have better angled pen and post-pen damage than the HVAT belts, which is why I use them. So the thing about the 229 is that it's very maneuverable, but it can bleed speed very fast if you pull too hard, and also it has no rudder and uses wing-mounted spoilers instead, which can make it hard to get the guns on target sometimes. This, combined with how many heavy tanks you encounter at this BR, makes me generally prefer the Narwhal from 6.7 instead, but some people may still prefer this. As for strategy in this lineup, there are a few things you want to consider. The biggest thing to keep in mind is that in up tiers, there are going to be a lot of very well-armored vehicles that APHE rounds just cannot penetrate frontally, so if you don't think there are any good positions where you can engage enemies from the side, you may want to consider running the SPZ-12. Otherwise, the Panther II, with its better mobility and higher rate of fire, will be better for more aggressive flanking, but the Tiger, with its better armor and firepower, might be better in situations where you're engaging more enemies head-on or are expecting to be on the receiving end of some return fire. The Kw.K, meanwhile, is a fantastic second or third spawn and will be able to both annihilate enemy aircraft as well as easily deal with enemy ground units if you can get the drop on them. And both the Narwhal and the 229 make for fantastic CAS options in this lineup. 7.0 continues to be an absolute favorite of mine, and if an opportunity ever arises to pick up one of these vehicles again, I cannot recommend them strongly enough. Moving on to 7.3, we have a pretty sparse lineup in terms of tech tree vehicles, though there are a pair of decent GE premiums at this BR, which I'll go over just so we actually have something to talk about. Your two tech tree vehicles are very similar in that they're both light vehicles armed with fast-firing 20mm autocannons with APDS rounds. These are the Weasel 1A4 and the Luchs. Their 20mm cannons are really only effective against light vehicles and aircraft, and will be unable to pen even the side armor of many medium and heavy tanks. Next we have the first of our two GE premiums, the LeKPz M47. This is mostly identical to the one in the American tech tree, except that it gets smoke grenades. This is overall just a very alright vehicle. It has acceptable protection, decent mobility, and good main gun penetration, though the post-pen damage is a little bit spotty. This is because it uses 90mm heat FS, which is well known for being unreliable. Because of this, some people like to use its APHE shell instead, but personally I consider its penetration just not sufficient for the battle rating. This is overall a perfectly decent vehicle, though it may not be the best choice for newer players. And lastly, we have what I would consider to be probably the best ground vehicle in this lineup, the RU-251. This Panzer was designed as a light recon vehicle based on the Cannon and Jagdpanzer chassis, and in that role it's absolutely excellent. While it may have pretty poor armor, it's low profile, has good gun handling, and its 90mm heat rounds are capable of easily penetrating just about anything you might encounter. Just be sure not to try and brawl with it. Looking at CAS, our first option is a squadron vehicle, the ME-262 A1A U1. This variant of the 262 features an armament of two MG-151 20mm cannons, two MK-108 low-velocity 30mm cannons, and two MK-103 high-velocity 30mm cannons. While the narwhal might be better down at 6.7, at 7.3 I find there are more medium and light armored vehicles around, which the MK-103s with API belts are going to be better at dealing with. The lower velocity MG-151s and MK-103s, meanwhile, can absolutely eviscerate lighter targets like SPAAs. The other option for CAS is the Arado 234C3. Unlike the earlier B2 variant, this one gets two extra engines and a pair of 20mm cannons, though its bomb armament remains the same. By setting autopilot for gunner and bomb sight to no, you can essentially use the bomb sight like CCIP. The advantage of using bombs over cannons is that you have a bit more standoff distance when engaging SPAAs, but with only 3 drops, your theoretical maximum number of destroyed enemy units is a lot lower. Also, if you're wondering why I suggest this over the IL-28, it's because that thing carries its payload in the bomb bay, which makes it harder to drop precisely in a dive, and also it isn't nearly as nimble. For strategy in this lineup, any of the ground vehicles mentioned can make for good first spawns depending on the situation, though honestly I think the RU-251 makes for a far better light tank than either of the tech tree options, thanks to having a main gun which can actually punch through armor. The M47 meanwhile is going to be the best bet on urban maps due to having much better survivability, or as a second spawn where that protection will help it deal with aircraft and SPAAs better. You could also use the Weasel as a third spawn SPAA, which is what it's technically classed as, though since it's using a 20mm, its range and damage aren't fantastic. Instead, your real goal should be to get either the 262 or the Arado. Both of these vehicles are great for killing ground units, and if you can get good enough with them, you can reliably turn the tide of the match all on your own. I think the best way to summarize 7.7 is that it has two truly outstanding vehicles and the rest are very mediocre. Starting off with one which is definitely not one of the outstanding vehicles, we have the M48A2. Compared to the A1 in the American tech tree, this version has a stronger engine, but is heavier, resulting in a slightly higher top speed in return for a lower power to weight ratio. It also has a different hull armor layout, which from the front is not really going to have much difference, but with the side being substantially better protected. What's probably the biggest difference though is the fact that it gets smoke grenades, which alone makes it far better than its American counterpart. That does not mean it's a great tank though. In the context of War Thunder at least, this is at best a marginal upgrade over the premium M47 at 1 BR notch lower. While it has a faster reload and a bit better frontal protection, it also has a worse turret rotation speed and slightly less gun depression, plus it can encounter 8.7 up tiers. I definitely say this one is skippable. Next we have the Marder A1. The best thing I can say about this vehicle is that it is a true jack of all trades. It has good gun elevation for its autocannon, so you can use it like an SPAA, it gets scouting, and its ATGMs can easily penetrate the armor of most vehicles it faces. The problem is, its autocannon only gets HVAP, which is just straight up terrible since it has poor angled pen and very bad post-pen damage, and it only gets 4 ATGMs, which only have a diameter of 103mm by the way, which makes their damage output quite mediocre. So while it can perform a lot of different tasks, it can't really do any of those tasks especially well. There is hope though, because this lineup features one of the most legendary vehicles in the game, the Mouse. This vehicle is no longer in the tech tree, however, during the yearly birthday event, this will become available for research, and as long as you put at least 1 point of RP into it during that time, you'll be able to continue researching it anytime you like. The E100 also sits at this battle rating, and in comparison is just a more mobile version of the Mouse with better side armor. However, at present, this vehicle is unobtainable, with every example for sale in the marketplace having been sold, so unfortunately you will very likely never get to play it. Anyways, the Mouse generally seems to have more of a reputation as a funny meme vehicle rather than for being very effective, which I assume is due to its extremely low speed, as well as the fact that, while it's comically well armored, heat shells and APDS can still punch right through that. A lot of people seem determined to use this thing as an assault tank, but personally I've found far more success using it as more of a sniper tank, hanging back and engaging enemies from a distance. This will make it even more difficult to hit the weak spots in the Mouse's armor, and also takes advantage of a unique shell type the Mouse gets access to. The Panzergranat TS rounds the Mouse gets are actually the only example in-game of APHEDS, that is to say, armor-piercing, high-explosive, discarding sabot. More specifically, this is an 88mm APHE shell fitted to a sabot fired out of the 128. This results in very high velocity and penetration, while also taking advantage of the massive post-pen damage of the high explosive shell. You also have a coaxial low-velocity 75mm gun, which fires heat shells with 115mm of penetration. This is great for helping you deal with light vehicles, but can also allow you to fake people out. Sometimes if you fire the coax, people will think you've just fired the main gun, and when they pop out from behind cover, you can use that to finish them off. The other really outstanding vehicle in this lineup is the PZH-2000. The two biggest standout features of this vehicle are, one, it gets a laser rangefinder, which is a pretty crazy feature for such a low BR vehicle, and two, it gets a proximity fused 155mm high explosive round. To use these, you'll want to create a setting for switch fuse mode so that you can change your shells from detonating on impact to proximity detonation. Combined with this vehicle's speedy reload and its high gun elevation, this will make this vehicle an unbelievably effective SPAA, though it will definitely take some practice to fully master. Going into the test drive in arcade mode is a great way to get used to the shell trajectory. Overall, 7.7 is really going to be dominated by the 1-2 punch of the Mouse and the PZH-2000. Use the Mouse to hang back and pick people off, and if you die, you can transition to the PZH, which is well equipped to kill both aircraft and ground vehicles alike. You can use the M48 and the Marder as backup vehicles if you need them, but honestly, these two aren't really going to be pulling much weight, and also, you don't have any new CAS options, though admittedly the Squadron 262 at 7.3 can still work plenty well here. Moving on to 8.0, Germany gets an extremely stacked lineup, and jumping right into it, we start off with the BMP-1. This is a pretty zippy little light tank armed with a 76mm gun firing heat shells, as well as an ATGM launcher on top. This combination makes it very effective at engaging multiple enemies at once thanks to its ability to rapidly get off follow-up shots. It also has a lot of dead space inside the vehicle, making it surprisingly survivable, as you can see in the background. The biggest downside is that it has very poor gun depression, so it may not be the best choice on hilly maps. Next we have the Marder 1A3. This is very similar to the earlier Marder A1, with the biggest changes being the addition of high hardness armor plates all around the vehicle, which will substantially improve survivability, especially against autocannons. You also get thermal sights, as well as APDS rounds for your 20mm cannon, which easily doubles your effective damage output. Though this added weight will make it slightly less mobile, overall I find the A3 Marder to be drastically more effective than its A1 predecessor, filling the same role as a sort of Swiss Army knife vehicle, but with a much higher degree of viability. Next we have yet another light tank, the DF-105. This is basically a Marder A1 hull with an oscillating turret, armed with a 5-second auto-loading 105mm cannon. This is not the more common L7 105mm gun, but rather a lower pressure French cannon which only fires heat shells. Its limited gun depression is probably the biggest thing holding it back, in that this prevents it from being able to use hard cover to make up for its lack of protection. But its great mobility and high rate of fire make it great for flanking. I should also mention there is a premium equivalent of this vehicle, which is just a straight up upgrade, the Clovis. The Clovis has better gun depression, faster turret traverse, a coaxial 20mm cannon, and most importantly, a laser rangefinder, and is absolutely fantastic as a premium. I don't actually own it, but you can find an old review of it in my Ground RB playlist, just please excuse the potato mic. Finally, we move on to something other than a light tank, and that's our first Leopard, the OG Leopard 1. This is a lightly armored but very mobile main battle tank which packs the very powerful 105mm L7, firing either HESH, Heat FS, or a PDS, though personally I strongly prefer a PDS on this, since while the damage isn't fantastic, it's pretty reliable as long as you hit center of mass. This is definitely not a good brawling vehicle, but on open maps it can be fantastic thanks to its great mobility, high velocity gun, rangefinder, and also thanks to the fact that its very high zoom optic works fantastic with the Luchs or Tochka sights. Next we have a very weird one, the Raketen Automat. This is basically an HS-30 hull with a pair of rapid-fire rocket launchers mounted to the top. Due to its insane damage output, this vehicle is incredible when you can actually get enemies in your sights. The problem is, the hull is pretty sluggish for this battle rating, as is your turret traverse, so this is definitely more of an ambush predator. It also has pretty paper-thin armor, so brawling isn't really the best idea either. And lastly, we wrap up with another tank destroyer, the Raketen Jagdpanzer II, which is essentially a Kanonen Jagdpanzer hull fitted with two SS-11 ATGM launchers. This vehicle is relatively speedy, has good gun depression, and the fact that you get two launchers is great for delivering follow-up shots or engaging multiple enemies. The biggest drawbacks are that this vehicle is pretty slow, and also the sight sits pretty high above the launchers, so sometimes you'll end up firing them into the ground on accident. Two very important notes about this vehicle. First, when stock, these missiles are keyboard guided, but there's a tier 3 modification which will make them mouse guided. The other thing is that when the background footage was taken, there was apparently, according to Gaijin, a bug with heat warheads which was causing them to not throw SPAL, but I did test it more recently and it seems like they're doing far more damage than what you're seeing here. While 8.0 has an extremely diverse selection of good first spawns for different situations, it does lack any solid CAS or SPAA options, though the PZH 2000 from 7.7 should still work just fine. For wide open maps, the Leopard is definitely my go-to, and for urban maps, I prefer the DF-105 or the BMP, due to them being pretty trolly in terms of survivability and having better damage output. The rocket panzers can be pretty good, but they tend to be very situational, and in most cases where I've had success with them, I think one of the other vehicles would have worked just as well. The Marder A3 is probably your best bet for second or third spawn in a lot of cases, due to having an autocannon, making it effective against aircraft and SPAAs. The last thing I'll note about this lineup is that there's a very high likelihood that Germany will eventually get a copy-paste T-54 variant of some kind, most likely the 1951 version at this BR, and if that ever happens, that will definitely become your best bet for urban maps because of its armor. Next we move on to a smaller but more well-rounded lineup, starting off with the M48A2G. This is yet another giant middle finger to the American mains, being actually superior to their M60 at the same battle rating, having better mobility, smoke grenade launchers, and most importantly by far, APF SDS rounds. These dart rounds will easily punch clean through the armor of just about any enemy vehicle you encounter, and will cause catastrophic post-penetration damage after the fact. It doesn't have the best optic though, nor does it have a laser rangefinder, so in up tiers in particular, it may be outclassed somewhat on larger maps. Next we have the Raketen Jagdpanzer II Hot. This is similar to the one at 8.0, except it replaces the twin SS-11 launchers for a single Hot launcher. The problem is, in the context of War Thunder, the Hot is not really a dramatic improvement over the SS-11, certainly not enough to justify losing a launcher, and also it only gets 5 degrees of gun depression. Honestly, I would just skip this one. Now we move on to a fan favorite, the Gepard. This is a speedy but lightly armored SPAA armed with twin 35mm autocannons, and has the ability to radar lock air targets. However, what most people seem to prefer it for is using this thing to flank people, and using the AP belts to rapidly shred entire groups of enemies. Two important controls to keep in mind for this one are switch radar / IRST search on/off, which will allow you to turn off your search radar and lower the profile of your vehicle, and lock radar / IRST target on, which will lock your tracking radar onto the air target and provide you a lead indicator. Probably the biggest highlight of this lineup though is the premium Term 3, which is one of those vehicles which feels like it should get boss music when it spawns in. This tank has paper-thin armor, but gets a 5-second auto-loading 105mm cannon with APDS rounds, along with a coaxial 30mm cannon with sap shells. This is probably the strongest firepower for any MBT around this battle rating, and the ability of the coax to annihilate any light vehicle you encounter is definitely a nice quality of life feature. Also worth noting is that it gets 12 degrees of gun depression, making it excellent on uneven terrain. For CAS, this lineup does get a strong new option with the F-84F. This is a small, relatively nimble strike fighter, which gets a very useful loadout of two 2,000 and two 1,000-pound bombs. Its small size and relatively good maneuverability are very important due to the number of radar-guided SPAA that you're going to be dealing with at this battle rating. You could also run the MiG-15 BIS since it gets rockets and also API rounds for its 37mm cannon, but in practice, I've not had nearly the same level of success with that thing that I have with the F-84, but maybe that's just skill issue on my part. For this lineup, I would typically recommend the M48 on maps where you expect to be engaging a lot of targets head-on, and either the Gepard or the Term 3 on maps where you're confident you can pull off a successful flank. The Gepard can also pull double duty as a second or third spawn, of course, being an SPAA with radar-directed fire control. Unlike some of our previous bomb CAS options, the F-84 doesn't get a bomb sight, which may make bombing a bit more difficult for newer players. I would recommend practicing in the test drive a bit, but as you saw earlier, once you get good with it, it can be absolutely great for dive bombing people. And like 8.0, I'll mention that there's a copy-paste vehicle which will probably end up in this lineup at some point, that being the T-55. If that does get added, that's definitely going to be your best bet for urban maps. Moving on to 8.7, we find an incredibly sparse lineup, but the vehicles we do have here are quite interesting. First off, we have the Jagdpanzer K. The actual story behind this thing is quite convoluted, but the short version is it's an Argentinian development of an Austrian light tank. In terms of mobility and armor, this thing is really nothing special, but it's absolutely insane in the firepower department. This vehicle gets a 4-second auto-loading 105mm cannon firing dart rounds, plus a laser rangefinder, Gen 3 thermals, and scouting. This makes it an absolutely incredible sort of scout sniper and gives it some of the best raw damage output of any vehicle around this battle rating, with the notable exception of the next vehicle I want to talk about. This vehicle is currently only obtainable on the marketplace or from loot crates, but it's so bizarre I couldn't not talk about it. This is the VT-12, which is weird for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's one of very few vehicles to feature more than one main cannon, and also because it's the only vehicle other than the Swedish STRV-103 family to feature hull aiming. This is a keybind you can activate which will cause the suspension of the vehicle itself to aim the guns where you're pointing, and definitely can take some getting used to. Once you do get used to it though, you'll be able to easily dispatch whole groups of enemies in very quick succession. Some other odd traits of this vehicle include the fact that it's entirely unarmored. All of the external structure is made up of structural steel, meaning machine guns will shred right through this thing. It also features a ludicrously powerful 2200 horsepower engine, giving it a horsepower to ton ratio of more than 50, which is just nuts. Lastly, for this lineup, we have our CAS option, and that's the G91. This vehicle can carry up to 4 keyboard-guided missiles, which, if you're good with them, can be used to pick off SPAA outside the range of their guns. I'm quite bad at this, to be honest, but I know there are some people out there who can absolutely mop up with these things. There's not a lot to say about this lineup in terms of strategy, since I assume 99% of you do not and never will own the VT-12, but what I will say is that the Jagdpanzer K is more than capable of carrying this lineup on its own, with the G91 making for good air support. Maybe bring up the Gepard from 8.3 if you really want to have a good second or third spawn, but I will say we may get the East German BMP-2 here in the future, who knows though. Now moving on to 9.0, I need to give a very important warning. If you are a newer player, let me assure you, past 9.0, this is where the fun stops. Past this BR, almost everyone will be running dart rounds and laser rangefinders, so if you slip up for even a second, you are going to die faster than you can blink. Even I only play past this BR if I'm certain I'm totally locked in. If you're not confident about this, I would recommend you spend more time playing your favorite lower BR vehicles until you feel like you're starting to become consistently successful. Otherwise, consider yourself warned. The first 9.0 we'll talk about is the TAM. This is an Argentine vehicle, essentially creating a light tank out of the Marder hull by sticking a 105mm gun on it. In practice, it feels like a more mobile Leopard 1 with worse armor and a bit less gun depression. It does get dart rounds and a laser rangefinder, so it makes for quite a good scout sniper. Next we have the Leopard A1A1. This is a marginal improvement over the baseline Leopard 1, getting a stabilizer and dart rounds, plus slightly improved protection. It does lack a laser rangefinder though, so it's much better suited to flanking at closer ranges compared to sniping at more extreme ranges. Next we have the Jaguar II. This is a very substantial upgrade over the Raketen Jagdpanzer Hot, getting a much more powerful tow missile and also having 18 degrees of gun depression, which will allow it to fire from positions which would be totally inaccessible to most other vehicles. It is open top though, so it's a little more vulnerable to airstrikes and artillery, but that's an absolutely worthwhile trade-off in my opinion. The TOW-A is usually going to be the most reliable missile available to you on this platform. However, the TOW-B, being a top attack weapon, may be better in cases where you're dealing with a lot of stationary enemies behind cover, even though its damage can be a little bit unreliable in my experience. And lastly, we have an event vehicle, the Class 3P. In some ways, this is just a better TAM, getting access to a much better APF SDS round, better gun depression, and better protection. The downside is it's much larger, making it a massive target, and it's wheeled so you can't maneuver on the spot so well, but for extremely large open maps, this is definitely going to be the superior choice. For CAS, we get a pretty strong option in this lineup, the Alpha Jet. This light attack aircraft gets access to countermeasures and CCIP for both its rockets and cannons, which gives it a degree of standoff attack capability and resistance to enemy SPAA. Its cannon also gets some pretty incredible semi-armor piercing shells, which will absolutely shred light targets. Just be cautious though, because even though this is a very competent CAS aircraft, there's still some very nasty SAM systems you can encounter which will kill you very easily. My rule of thumb for this lineup is, if the map is big enough to need a laser rangefinder, I run the TAM or the Class 3P if you have it, and if not, run the A1A1. The Jaguar is more of a niche vehicle, but on hilly maps where it can use that gun depression, it can be absolutely excellent. Unfortunately, there aren't really any great second or third spawns, but the Alpha Jet is great at CAS at least. Moving on to 9.3, we find ourselves with a very MBT-heavy lineup, and unusually, all of these vehicles are actually good options, despite all being extremely different. The first of these is the KPZ-70, and boy does this one make me feel old, because I was playing this back when it was still tied with the T-64A for being the best tank in the game. The KPZ-70 was part of a joint project between the US and Germany to develop a next-generation main battle tank, which would eventually evolve into both the Abrams and the Leopard 2, and as is par for the course at this point, the German version is of course better than the American one. This is because the German version gets a very slightly more powerful engine, twice as many smoke grenade launchers, and most importantly, an autoloader with a reload speed of 6 seconds instead of the 7.5 seconds on the American one. The one drawback of the German version is that it reloads the barrel-launched ATGM much more slowly, but you want to be using the dart round anyways, so all in all, this doesn't really matter. And speaking of primary armament, though the main gun is 152mm in diameter, this does not translate to a more powerful dart round. Remember, residual penetration is what determines damage on dart rounds, so the relatively low penetration values on this one does translate to less damage. A few other quirks on this vehicle include a roof-mounted 20mm cannon, spaced armor, and hydropneumatic suspension, which can allow it to reach some insane levels of gun depression. Now we have the M48 Super. This is a unique German upgrade package for the M48 with a more powerful engine, a laser rangefinder, thermal sights, and most distinctively, some blocks of composite armor around the turret. Do keep in mind though that these composite screens are really only effective against shape charge warheads, and kinetic penetrators will still be able to punch clean through the front of this thing basically anywhere. Next we have the East German T-72M1. This is nearly identical to the T-72A in the Soviet tech tree, except that it gets the add-on armor modification stock and is very slightly lighter. This is by far the most heavily armored of your options at this battle rating, though it suffers from having an absolutely terrible reverse gear and bad gun depression. And for the last of our vehicles at this BR, we have the Leopard 1A5. This is yet another incremental upgrade for the Leopard 1, which compared to the A1A1, one BR notch lower, gets a better dart round, thermals, and a laser rangefinder. This vehicle has the weakest armor of all the available tanks at this BR, but is also quite low profile and zippy. I should mention that there are 3 other tanks available at this BR, either as premiums or event vehicles, but in my opinion, none of them are really worth it. They're all essentially just side grades at best to the Leopard 1A5 in terms of their usage in battle, and there are plenty of other premium or event vehicles out there which are much better uses of your money. Unfortunately, there are no new good CAS or SPAA options available at this battle rating, so you'll need to drag those up from a lower BR instead. Like I said earlier, all of the options available at this BR are good, but which one you think is best really just comes down to preference. The T-72 is of course going to be your best bet for urban maps, but for larger, more open maps, all of the other 3 can work. I would generally regard the KPZ as the best second spawn though, due to having not super strong but pretty trolly armor, an autocannon for dealing with light vehicles and low-flying aircraft, plus a very fast reload. On night maps or maps with bad weather though, the Leopard and the M48 will be your best choices since they have thermals, with the Leopard being a bit better for larger maps thanks to its higher top speed. Moving on to 9.7, we get a much more diverse lineup, starting off with the Panzer 57, better known as the Bagel Panzer thanks to our friend Fly Daily. This is yet another Marder hull IFV, except this one gets access to a 57mm autocannon and a tow missile launcher. This autocannon has two main types of rounds it fires. The first are HEVT rounds, which makes this thing actually quite good at killing aircraft, and also, weirdly, AP solid shot. These AP rounds don't have the best penetration, but being full caliber rounds, they'll do absolutely devastating post-pen damage if they do penetrate. We also have two SPAA, the Osa-AK and the Luchs A2. Both of these use stingers as their primary weapons, but the Weasel can double as a light scout, whereas the Luchs has more solid defense against ground targets thanks to having autocannons. Do note with both of these vehicles though that the default Stinger E lacks a proximity fuse, so you definitely want to rush to upgrade to the K version as soon as possible. Both versions of the missile do possess IRCCM though, which makes them quite tricky to dodge, especially at close range. Lastly, for tech tree vehicles, we have a new tank destroyer, the Weasel 1A2. This gets the same very punchy toe-tomb missile as the earlier Jaguar 2, except on an absolutely tiny chassis with even more gun depression at 20 degrees, making it one of the greatest rat tanks in the entire game. You may have noticed that none of the available tech tree options have a proper main gun. However, there is one event vehicle option available for a pretty low price on the marketplace, the R400. The main standout features of this vehicle compared to other wheeled vehicles around this BR include the fact that it's actually relatively small, and also it features Gen 2 thermals, which gives this thing a significant leg up in target detection for the battle rating. Looking at CAS, you have two pretty solid options in my opinion. The first is the Mi-24, which is going to be the only helicopter I'll recommend in this tech tree. The reason for that is that its ATGMs are much faster than the Western ones, so it doesn't feel like they take multiple business days to arrive on target the way the Western ones do. It also has R60Ms, which can be very useful for countering enemy aircraft, and when you run out of ATGMs, you still have rockets and a very punchy 30mm cannon you can use to mop up enemy ground units. Try to take out enemy SPAA first, though. Also, the premium is just a copy-paste version in case you'd rather just buy this for GE. The other option is the Squadron Swiss Hunter. This vehicle actually gets a pair of Mavericks, which give you some credible standoff attack capability at a very low BR. I usually use these to hit the enemy SPAAs, go evasive, then land and rearm. Then I start mopping up the rest of the enemy ground vehicles, rinse and repeat. 9.7 is overall very much a support-centered lineup. The Bagel Panzer is probably the best first spawn in most cases, but will require you to flank quite aggressively in order to make use of its main gun, and it doesn't have a ton of ATGMs to use. The Luchs is quite a good SPAA though, and situationally the Weasel can also be quite strong. Plus your CAS options are extremely potent. Still, I would only classify this as a properly competitive lineup when run with the R400 if you're willing to drop about 20 Gaijin coin. Otherwise, I would run most of these vehicles with your 10.0 lineup, which we'll discuss next. Moving on to 10.0, we start off with yet another wheeled quote-unquote light tank, even though this thing is the size of a house, the Jagdpanzer 90. This is a very fast, surprisingly well-protected vehicle, which you can basically think of as a wheeled Leopard. Thanks to having spaced armor, plus many heavily sloped overlapping sections, as well as a lot of internal volume, the Jagdpanzer can tank shots surprisingly well at times, and this thing is also very fast, so it's great for rushing out to ambush positions early in the match. The other first spawn you have access to in this lineup is our first vehicle in the Leopard 2 series, the Leopard 2K. This is a prototype variant which does not get composite armor, though it does get some spaced armor like the Jagdpanzer. This vehicle gets access to a 120mm gun rather than the 105mm on the Jagdpanzer, but do keep in mind that this does not translate to an increase in damage. The penetration values of the 120mm DM23 and 105mm DM33 shells are very similar. The main advantage on the 120 is just the fact that it has a much higher velocity. You also get a roof-mounted 20mm cannon, which is very helpful for dealing with all of the Russian IFVs you encounter around this BR. There is also a new SPAA, this BR, the Flakpanzer 1, but the missiles on that thing are just not super great for killing aggressively maneuvering targets, and personally, I think the Gepard at 9.7 is going to be more useful for ground RB. Lastly, for this battle rating, we have a very cool CAS option, the Su-22 UM-3K. The main offensive weapon of this aircraft is its laser-guided air-to-ground missiles, the KH-25s and the KH-29s. Though you can't auto-track targets like aircraft at higher BRs can, if you set up a control for activate target point, you can manually steer these missiles onto target. These are great for dealing with SPAAs from a distance, and once they're expended, you still have some rocket pods and a very powerful 30mm cannon left to hit other ground targets with. 10.0 is definitely not the most fleshed out lineup on its own, however, the Pakwagon and the LeKPz 2K both make for excellent first spawns, with the Pakwagon being better on large open maps and the 2K being better for tighter, more urban ones. That being said, the 9.7 support vehicles still work quite well at this battle rating, and running the Flakpanzer followed by the Gepard A1 as second and third spawns can make for a very powerful combination in my experience. Also, I want to add a disclaimer here that everything above this BR tends to get moved around a lot in terms of BR readjustments, so I apologize in advance if some of these lineups quickly become out of date. 10.3 is a lineup where we're going to start seeing some really potent vehicles, starting off with a vehicle which is one of those cases where the vehicle itself doesn't look super impressive, but always just seems to inexplicably work extremely well, the TAM 2C. Compared to the base TAM at 9.0, the main upgrades featured on the 2C include a better dart round, a laser warning receiver, which is a relatively rare feature, plus Gen 3 thermals. This makes the TAM 2C an excellent mobile scout sniper, but given its poor protection, definitely not a vehicle you want to be brawling with. Next we have the Puma infantry fighting vehicle. Despite being classed as a light tank, the Puma is also incredibly well armored, being frontally protected by multiple layers of heavily angled spaced armor and blocks of ERA and composite armor on its sides. It also has an unmanned turret and features an electro-optical active protection system to help deal with ATGMs. Its 30mm main gun is pretty slow firing and doesn't have the best damage output, but it has two types of very useful shells. The first is APF-SDS, which is pretty self-explanatory, but the second is a very uncommon type known as head rounds, though the game labels them as shrapnel shells. These shells are sort of like programmable HE rounds, except instead of just exploding, they shower the area in front of them with tungsten pellets when they detonate. Combined with the auto-tracker feature, which allows you to visually track air targets, the head rounds make the Puma very dangerous against low-flying aircraft. We also have two different SAM systems at this battle rating, the Osa and the Strela, and in short, I find the Strela is much better for ground RB. This is because while the Osa's missiles certainly have greater range, the launcher itself has a very slow turret rotation speed and is very bad at hitting targets up close. Against the low-flying, maneuvering targets you tend to encounter in ground RB, which often pop up and then leave with little warning, these are not ideal traits for an SPAA. One other thing you should know about the Strela is that its missile seeker actually has two different guidance modes, normal IR mode and optical contrast mode. Optical contrast mode will basically cause the missile to track the dark shape of the aircraft itself, contrasted against the blue sky behind it, though this has the obvious drawback of not working very well at night or in poor weather. By default, the seeker will decide which one to use automatically, but you can use the keybind switch guidance method to decide manually. Overall, I think the first, second, third spawn combination of the TAM, the Puma, and the Strela is quite a strong combination all on its own, but there are some marketplace vehicles you may also want to consider adding to this lineup. The first is the Boxer MGS. This vehicle fills a similar niche to the TAM 2C, except with better gun handling, a higher top speed, a 5-second autoloader, and an auto tracker like the Puma, interestingly enough. The downside of this vehicle is that it's extremely large and poorly protected, so this is best used only on maps where you anticipate there will be some very long-range engagements. Your other option, though, is probably the strongest in the entire lineup, the Leopard 2 AV. This is yet another Leopard 2 pre-production vehicle, but unlike the ones we've seen previously, this one has a fully fleshed out composite armor package. While you might assume that since this is a prototype, its armor should be worse than the production Leopard 2A4, which it's most similar to, in actuality, its turret armor is only barely worse, and the whole armor is actually stronger than the 2A4's. Also, while it has a 105mm cannon instead of a 120, again, because it uses DM33 compared to the DM22 found in the 2A4, your post-pen damage will be just about identical. All you're losing out on is a bit of velocity. Being well armed, highly mobile with solid protection, the 2AV is an absolutely fantastic pickup. In terms of CAS, you can use the F4F with its Mavericks, but you're going to be significantly outranged by a lot of the radar-guided SAMs you encounter, and the Phantom airframe doesn't exactly have the best acceleration or energy retention. Like I mentioned earlier, the 1-2-3 punch of the TAM, Puma, and Strela is going to be your strongest combination, but the 2AV is definitely a better stand-in for the TAM on urban maps or in situations where you think you're going to be taking a lot of return fire. Overall, this is a very powerful and versatile lineup, especially if you're playing support. So 10.7 only actually has one new tech tree vehicle, but it's a very good one. This is of course the Leopard 2A4. Admittedly, for a while this vehicle has been struggling pretty badly due to the amount of up tiers it was getting, but with recent BR decompression, this tank is probably in the strongest position it's ever been in. The 2A4 gets an excellent combination of mobility, armor, and firepower, and while its main gun may struggle to penetrate the frontal armor of some T80 and T72 variants around this battle rating, if you can manage to get good at slipping rounds into their lower hole like you see me doing in the background footage, you can pop them left and right no problem. There is also a premium copy-paste version of this vehicle, with the only differences to the tech tree version being getting a camo net and losing access to the dozer blade modification. However, you don't actually want to equip that modification in the first place though, since it adds about 1.5 tons of extra weight for very little benefit. While there are no other tech tree vehicles available at this battle rating, we do have an interesting event vehicle that can complement this lineup, the Vilkas. I know some people feel this vehicle is dog shit, but I think that's being a little bit too harsh. So to be fair, the Vilkas is not the best at actually getting a lot of kills, but what it is extremely good at is annoying the crap out of the enemy team. This is because, for one, it gets 20 degrees of gun depression, allowing it to fire over very steep cover. It has an unmanned turret, which makes it very difficult to kill when hold down. It gets spike ATGMs, which are a bit unreliable, but are fire and forget, and since they come down at an angle, they can hit enemies behind cover. For this lineup, one way or another, the Leopard 2A4 is going to be your mainstay. It's a true main battle tank in the sense that it can do absolutely everything well, whether that be sniping, brawling, or flanking, and it has a very strong set of support vehicles to run alongside it. Assuming you don't have the Vilkas, the Puma and the Strela from 10.3 still work great as second and third spawns, or alternatively, you can run the tech tree and premium 2A4s together. At 11.0, we only have one new tech tree vehicle, and that's the Puma VJTF. This is pretty much identical to the earlier Puma, except with spike ATGM launchers. These spikes are kind of infamous for being unreliable, however, since the Puma doesn't have the best defensive firepower to begin with, it just means I'm going to use the same playstyle as a passive scout and support vehicle. In case you missed my description of the earlier Puma, I'll mention that this thing is hilariously survivable for a light vehicle, and you can see it here surviving a direct hit from an artillery shell. It also gets ahead programmable shrapnel shells with auto tracking, making this vehicle very dangerous against aircraft too. There is also an event vehicle available at this battle rating, and that's the PT-16. This is yet another Leopard 2 test vehicle, which, despite being at a higher battle rating than the production 2A4, lacks its composite inserts, a laser rangefinder, or thermals. What it does have, though, is superior mobility and a 4-second autoloader. This makes the PT-16 unbelievably effective as a flanking vehicle, though you're really going to suffer on very large maps due to not having a laser rangefinder. Subjectively, I don't find this thing to be noticeably less survivable than the 2A4 despite lacking composite armor. However, I suspect that's only because I had a bush on the turret to break up the silhouette, and if people assume this is a 2A4, they're probably going to end up trying to aim at weak spots even though that isn't actually necessary. And lastly, we do have one more CAS option for this battle rating, and that's the Su-22 M4. This is otherwise extremely similar to the earlier Su-22 we talked about, but the biggest change is that it gets access to 2 KH-29Ts. These are massive TV-guided fire-and-forget missiles that make Mavericks look like toys and will pulverize main battle tanks even with a near miss. I've had a lot of success using these to attack enemy SPAAs from long distance before re-engaging to attack the rest of the enemy team with rockets and cannons. Overall, 11.0 can make for really not a bad lineup if you have all three of these vehicles, though to be honest, I'm not expecting many of you to drop $150 to get the PT-16 on the marketplace. Instead, I'd mostly recommend just using the Puma as a support or backup vehicle in later lineups, since given the weird niche it fills, it's pretty up-tier proof. Next, we skip a gap in the tech tree to one entire BR higher and arrive at 12.0. Well, okay, technically there's an SPAA at 11.7, which I'm just going to include in this lineup, since you would never run that thing alone, at least unless you're some sort of sociopath. First off, we'll talk about the main MBT of this lineup, the Leopard 2A4M, which is a pack premium. Now, most important thing about the tank first, make sure you remove the mine protection and slat armor modifications. These modifications add almost a full ton of extra weight without providing any level of actually useful protection in the context of War Thunder. With that out of the way, the 2A4M is a Canadian modernization of the base Leopard 2A4. The biggest improvements over the regular 2A4 include a much better dart round, Gen 3 thermals, composite screens around the side of the hull and the turret, plus reinforced turret frontal armor. What's very important to note about this thing though is that it does not get reinforced hull armor, aside from a thin composite screen over the heavily angled part of the top hull. This means that pretty much any enemy main battle tank you encounter will be able to punch clean through the front of your hull like it's nothing. Now back to that 11.7 SPAA I mentioned earlier, this is the Flak. This is basically a school bus armed with a 2-shot launcher of VT-1 missiles. One thing I need to mention is that this chassis is extremely sluggish, more so than the stat card would seem to indicate. It will struggle a lot to get up even shallow inclines, and it feels like it has the power to weight ratio of a toaster. Aside from that though, the VT-1s are pretty good, pulling up to 50 Gs and having excellent acceleration. And with nearly 8 kilograms of high explosive and 10 degrees of gun depression on the launcher, these missiles can definitely be dangerous against ground targets too. The radar itself on this vehicle is pretty sensitive, so you can even pick up and shoot down small targets like air-to-ground missiles. This system has infrared search and track too, which you should definitely set up the control for, because this will allow you to passively track targets without setting off their radar warning receivers. Since this lineup obviously centers primarily around the Leopard 2A4M, I'd like to quickly talk about how this thing performs as a premium. Its main competitor is going to be the M1A1 Clickbait, and compared to that vehicle, really the only solid leg up it gets is its thermals, with the Clickbait otherwise having a better dart round, better armor, and a faster reload. However, a lot more noobs play America than Germany, and to give you an idea of how much that will affect gameplay, in the Clickbait when I tested it, I was getting around a 2-to-1 KD average, whereas with the 2A4M, I was getting around a 2.5 to 1 KD average, despite the Clickbait being objectively better. Overall, that means the 2A4M is a very viable premium in my opinion, and when run with the Spike Puma and the Flak, you have a pretty decent lineup. Also for CAS, I would still recommend running the Su-22 M4. Even at top tier, those KH-29Ts are nothing to scoff at. Moving on to 12.3, we have two more Leopard 2 variants, the first of which is the Leopard 2A5. The main notable upgrade it features over the previous 2A4 is its armor protection. This includes the distinctive wedge-shaped turret you'll see on future variants of the Leopard 2, which renders its turret effectively immune to even the most powerful kinetic penetrators. Its hull armor also receives an upgrade offering about 440mm of protection, which is good, don't get me wrong, but most top-tier dart rounds will still go right through this. We also get a new dart round, DM53, which is one of the best in the whole game, and gives the 2A5 better firepower than even many top-tier MBTs. The other Leopard 2 variant is the Leopard 2 PL. This is an upgrade package for the Leopard 2A4 used by the Poles, and it does get upgraded turret armor, which is nearly as strong as the wedge turret, though it does have a lot more weak spots, and it also gets DM53. That being said, the hull armor isn't reinforced like the 2A5, so it's going to have the same weak performance as the 2A4. The only reason you would ever take this over the 2A5 is due to the fact that this thing gets Gen 3 thermals, which makes it much more competitive on night maps or in bad weather. Also, fun fact, I had a full review of the Leopard 2 PL about 90% done a few months ago, right when Gaijin did its last round of BR decompression and completely reworked it by giving it DM53 and raising its battle rating, so that was great. We also have a notable cast platform at this battle rating, that's the Tornado IDS SLE. This is the only Tornado I would actually recommend taking into ground battles, and that's because this is the only Tornado which possesses a truly viable standoff precision attack capability. This is because of its ability to carry a weapon called the Hosbo. This is a 500-pound glide bomb with IR guidance, making it fully fire and forget, and allowing it to track targets without any input from the launching aircraft. You can carry up to 4, but I prefer bringing 3 plus the targeting pod for better sight fidelity. Best practice is to use these to try and hit enemy SPAA, go hard evasive, and once you're confident these are dealt with, you can return and start trying to kill enemy tanks. Just be aware that SPAAs are extremely dangerous at this battle rating, so this will take some practice, and even then, this requires a lot of caution. Overall, 12.3 is a very solid lineup in spite of its small size. The Leopard 2A5 remains totally competitive even in up tiers against 12.7s, and while the 2PL is slightly inferior in most cases, it remains a perfectly capable alternative for night and bad weather maps thanks to its thermals. In addition, Tornado gives you top tier standoff strike capability without dragging up your battle rating. I do hope we get more vehicles around this BR in the future to help flesh it out a bit more though. And now guys, we finally reach the top dogs at 12.7. I do have to give the caveat that one of these vehicles in particular is very likely to be bumped up to 13.0 in the future, and I think the reason for that will become very obvious in a second. First though, let's take a look at the Leopard 2A6. This is a very good top tier main battle tank, having some of the best kinetic main gun penetration of any vehicle in the game, and with turret armor that is very nearly invincible, though the hull is a bit weak. If that sounds almost exactly like what I said about the 2A5 variant, well, you'd be correct. In fact, the only major difference between this vehicle and the 2A5 is the longer gun. While the longer L55 gun is certainly an improvement over the L44 found on the earlier Leopard 2 variants, honestly, it makes very little noticeable difference in practice, and the 2A6 being at a higher BR than the 2A5 is extremely bizarre, especially considering they were the same battle rating for a very long time. Just to make clear, the 2A6 is very good, but you can get basically identical performance with the 2A5 at a lower battle rating. The 2A6 remains an incredibly dangerous hold-down sniper though, even at top tier, but just be careful about its hull armor because this is going to really hold you back when brawling. Next we have the Leopard 2 PSO. This variant of the Leopard 2 was mainly optimized for low-intensity urban warfare, gaining additional composite armor on the sides of the hull and turret, and a very helpful roof-mounted 50 caliber machine gun, though it uses the shorter L44 120mm gun, not the L55. Don't be worried about all that extra weight impacting your mobility too much though, because this vehicle also has an upgraded engine, meaning its power-to-weight ratio is only marginally worse than the 2A6. I should mention there are currently multiple outstanding bug reports related to this thing's hull protection, including getting spall liners around the hull and reinforced frontal hull armor, so we may see this thing get some serious improvements in the future. And last off, we have the undisputed king of top-tier ground RB, the Leopard 2A7. This vehicle retains the same great firepower and turret armor of the 2A6, but with about a 50% increase to frontal hull protection, hull spall liners, and Gen 3 thermals. These survivability improvements allow the 2A7 to survive an absolutely unbelievable amount of punishment, and its only true frontal weak spot is the lower front plate. I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to describe this thing as the mouse of its BR bracket. While it does have slightly inferior mobility to the 2A6, this massive increase in survivability is absolutely worth it, plus the Gen 3 thermals are a huge quality of life upgrade. While the other two 12.7s really required me to lock in order to do well with, the 2A7 is just a brain-dead bully and is probably the strongest German tank for its battle rating since the King Tiger at 6.7. Next, we do have both an SPAA and a CAS option I want to talk about, but using these is a lot more of an intricate process than their earlier equivalents, so I want to walk you guys through this in test drive. First off, let's look at the IRIS-T. So first things first, to use this you're going to want to set up keybinds for auxiliary vehicle deployment and switch to auxiliary vehicle. This will allow you to place and then control your launch vehicles. I typically like to drive both of these things in opposite directions from one another so that one bomb or missile won't kill all of your vehicles at once, and ideally you want to get these things behind some hard cover if possible. The next thing you want to do is make sure you have a keybind set for radar control screen. This will show you a top-down view of the airspace around your radar vehicle and allows you to simply click on radar targets you want to engage and fire at them using the right mouse button. Keep in mind that while these missiles receive targeting data from your radar, they're actually IR guided with IRCCM, so they cannot be spoofed by notching or multipathing, which makes them very annoying for fixed-wing aircraft to have to deal with. On the other hand though, they're going to be very weak against helicopters with counter-IR systems. One other thing, you can use this system to shoot down incoming missiles, and especially if you see an Su-30 spamming KH-38s at your teammates, that's probably something you'll want to do, but if you believe you're about to be overwhelmed, you may want to just turn your radar off and scoot behind cover. Also, just to future-proof this guide a bit, I should mention that anti-radiation missiles, or missiles which will chase radar emissions, are likely to be added later this year, and when that happens, you're going to want to periodically disable your radar and move around a bit in case one launches on you without you noticing. And now moving on to cast, let's take a look at the Eurofighter AESA armed with Spice IR-guided glide bombs. The first thing you'll want to do is go into the map menu and mark a target point in the enemy spawn with the middle mouse button. This way, your targeting pod will already be looking at where most of the enemy SPAA are, allowing you to locate and engage them more quickly. You then want to get relatively close, usually between 4 to 6 kilometers depending on the map, and then you want to pop up and start dropping these on as many targets as quickly as you can. Once you've dropped your bombs, you then want to rush back down to the deck and book it out of there. These bombs do have quite a bit of range to them, so they should have no trouble hitting targets from this distance. They aren't the fastest though, and that makes them easier to intercept, but dropping multiple at the same time will make that harder. Also, definitely set the bomb activation time to 0 so they detonate on impact. If you can manage to take out all of the enemy SPAA, you can then return to the engagement area to start hunting other enemy ground units. If the enemy team has no competent SPAA players up, you can easily wipe out most of the enemy team all on your own. Overall, I think Germany has an extremely powerful top-tier lineup at the moment. The 2A7 easily outclasses any American or Russian 12.7s currently available, and while it can be fun to use the spice bombs to bully people, personally, I'm not the biggest fan of dragging yourself 1 BR notch higher when the 2A7 is already so strong. For those of you who made it this far, thank you a ton for sitting through all my rambling. This video was quite a while in the making. I started working on it in October of 2025 and didn't finish until February of 26, but given the demand I've been getting for more ground RB guides, this was something I really wanted to finish. I do definitely plan on creating more entries in the series, especially for the other major tech trees. However, I don't have those nearly as thoroughly researched as the German ones, so those may take a while. Most likely Sweden and Japan will be the next ones I finish. If you want to help me along with getting future installments created faster though, I will humbly ask that you support the channel, even if that just means sitting and watching my other videos or future live streams. Anything that tells the algorithm my content is good will drive more traffic to the channel, and more traffic on the channel means more support from Gaijin to help me make all this content for you guys. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Check out the playlist in the description for more ground RB content, and I'll see you guys in the next one.